Hello! Welcome to Mars Talk, a community discussion about humanity's future in space. Now, this is episode 2. Our first episode did really well. Thank you so very much for all your support, watching, commenting, sharing. Make sure to continue to do that because we are still new, so we definitely want to continue to grow the channel and the podcast. Now, this is presented by the Mars Society, and all of our episodes will be in both audio and video format. You can find those at www.marstalk.org. MARSTALK.org. Now, in addition to that, you can find Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. We have a Discord server. All of those will be very easy to find right there on the right-hand side of the website at marstalk.org. Also, we want to make sure that everybody understands that all of the opinions expressed during the podcast are those of the individuals giving them. They are not necessarily the views or position of the Mars Society. We are a large international organization, and while we all agree on the core belief that people should be living on Mars and as quickly as possible, we probably will and definitely will disagree on many other things. In this episode, that will definitely be the case, but we will do so respectfully, and I look forward to the lively discussion. Now, today, we have a couple different people joining us. Of course, we have James Burk and Dr. Jonathan Clarke, as well as myself, Christopher Tarantola, your humble host. Now, Dr. Jonathan Clarke has had a substantial career in geology, studying and prospecting all over Australia, and even ventured out as far as South America exploring for various resources. He is also an astrobiologist and is the president of the Mars Society Australia. Thanks for coming. Also, we have James. James is the senior manager at Arctic Consulting, director of IT, and a steering committee member at the Mars Society, and the organizer of the Seattle Scrum Meetup, as well as a Mars Talk producer. Thanks, guys. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And me too.
All right. So, the first thing we're going to talk about is the most important story, I think, that has come out of the last 2 weeks is Palpatine is back in Star Wars. And I see James is representing over here. No, okay. So, well, I'm sure we could talk about that for a long time. We'll go to real news stories. I'm probably going to do that like every episode. I love that joke. Okay. NASA InSight lander experiences its first Mars quake on April 6th. The 128th Sol, or Martian Day. InSight's seismometer picked up an event described as a likely Mars quake. Similar in size and duration to those detected on the moon from the Apollo missions, the seismometers they put on the moon. But it is differentiated from the local hammering and of the mole. They have the little mole instrument, as well as the wind. So you get 3 distinct audio sections in this clip. We're going to go ahead and run the clip for everybody, and then we'll start talking about it. So go ahead and run the clip. All right, guys. So, what do you think? What do you make of this? This is exciting news. It sounds like we're really starting to get science going on the InSight's mission.
Yeah, we've been looking for this for a long time. The Viking landers back in 1976 each had a seismometer, but some genius mounted it actually on the deck of the spacecraft rather than closely coupled with the ground. So all they got was wind vibration. The advantage of the InSight seismometer is it's actually planted on the ground and got a cover to minimize wind effects. So a better arrangement. Interestingly enough, in the 80s, the Venera landers on Venus also detected microseismic events. So we now have the third planet which have picked up these things: the Moon, Mars, and Venus. So this is a major development. It tells us there is internal activity on Mars. It's too small an event to say much about what's going on. It's the sort of thing that we wouldn't even detect on Mars because Earth's a noisy place. We've got winds and tides and storms, ocean currents,
You mean
human
we
activity.
wouldn't detect here on Earth, is what you meant?
That's right.
Yeah.
This is much more sensitive, and so we get these tiny little events showing up, and hopefully big ones, because big ones tell us a lot about the interior structure of a planet and what's going on, and the size of things like the core, whether or not the core is liquid or solid, how thick the mantle is, how thick the crust is, and so on. And this is what we've done on Earth with seismology, and also on the Moon, and now hopefully we can do it on Mars.
Right, and so James, the big events that we're looking to maybe pick up to get the inside geology of Mars, if
Mhm.
there isn't a lot of super active tectonics or internal workings of Mars, is there anything that might make that happen?
Well, this instrument's very sensitive, as John mentioned. I mean, it's going to pick up whatever size quakes there are. This one was a small one, and it'll also be able to pick up larger ones, and it could pick up other events like meteor strikes. And all of those are going to be useful in going into the models of how the plate tectonics, or so to speak, of Mars work, and the seismic activity. Everything we capture with that instrument, it's going to be important to understanding the planet.
Agreed. So and it also I think helps to know that things are working well. And did we ever get an update on they had paused the mole from going down? Have they fixed that yet? Do we know?
No, not as far as I know. I think they're still working on test models here on Earth, and trying to get a workaround. I mean, one of the advantages of a lander is it's not going to go anywhere, and so it's not like an orbiting spacecraft where time may be a factor because you've got limited propellant, and there's other factors. You know, you can actually it's just going to sit there. It's not going to move.
Well, what
And
about like the solar panels with dust? I mean, I would imagine at some level that might be a factor.
Opportunity lasted for
15
14
years.
years, 15 years, and it's at the equator, so providing it's cleaned periodically by wind gusts, I don't think that's going to be an issue.
Yeah, one thing people don't realize is dust devils will come by and clean off the solar panels periodically. So kind of a solar system doesn't necessarily degrade linearly over the course of the mission. It's
Mm-hmm.
going to get cleaned off, and its power is going to get boosted by those natural events.
So it's going to look more like the stock market or something like that.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
Yeah,
Okay.
and
Go
the
ahead.
thing too, Insight has got very large solar panels, and compared to a rover, it doesn't use a lot of power, and so it's getting a lot more power than say Spirit or Opportunity did, and it uses less, and so
There's more
it's
budget.
fast in terms of dust buildup on the panel surfaces.
Okay.
So, barring a major dust storm which will blanket out everything, not so much from dust on the panels, but just because there's much less light and there's not enough to keep the thing alive, metaphorically speaking, it should be fine.
Okay. All right. Well, moving on to the next story here, we got the Australian Space Agency was recently formed the middle of last year on July 1st. The agency's goals center primarily on boosting private industry and international cooperation rather than on explicit exploration or government programs. The part of their operation, the Australian Space Agency has a good talking relationship with the Mars Society Australia. And since we happen to have somebody that's a little bit more intimate with the specifics of that, I'm going to let him talk a lot more about that. So, Dr. Jonathan, tell us what's going on with the space agency and how are they interacting with Mars Society Australia?
Well, this is a pretty big deal. It's been a matter of some embarrassment for people active in the space sector in Australia, whether they are enthusiasts like the Mars Society people or whether they are professionals using space data, that we have not had a space agency until the middle of last year. We have been, the space community in Australia has been pushing this for decades. And the hostility from the powers that be has been quite remarkable. And
What does
I
that
think
center
partly
around?
we've now been, sorry?
I apologize, but what does that center around?
Well, it's hard to know, but it goes back at least to the 60s. In the 60s, Australia is actually the third country to launch a satellite from its own territory, from the Woomera rocket range in South Australia. There was a surplus. NASA have been doing some very high altitude sounding rocket tests
Mm-hmm.
using Redstone boosters, the same thing that put Gus Grissom and Alan Shepard into space. And there was one left over, and the Weapons Research Facility in Adelaide built a small satellite that flew from that. And that was in the 1965, round about then. But it didn't come to anything. And ever since then, there basically people were saying every time the idea of a space agency came up was sort of over our dead body. And people were sort of heard to mutter, well, that could be arranged. But I think
Friendly
several things
conversation.
came. Yeah, several things drove that. I mean, first of all, that there was a perception that Australia was a very small country, even though an advanced country technologically and economically, well-developed country, with a lot of expertise. The space agencies and space activities were the province of major countries like the US, the Soviet Union, and so on in the 60s, and then later on, sort of the European Space Agency and China and Japan. And little old Australia couldn't compete in that sector. Secondly, I think there was a fear that once you had a space sector or space agency, you'd go from just launching small satellites that met national needs to putting people wanting to put people into space and go to the moon and other sort of grandiose plans. So there was a fear of sort of runaway expansion. And what's been happening in recent years, I think partly there's awareness that almost every country on Earth of any significance has a space agency. Well, Singapore has a space agency,
Right.
Laos space agency, New Zealand across the Tasman have a space agency, and we're really being left behind in terms of opportunities for collaboration. And to get collaboration, even commercial collaboration, you need a legislative framework. You need a government agency who makes sure that the playing field works, so you can sign agreements at national level. So, for example, with a space agency, a country can, when a call goes out for instruments on a probe to go to Mars, potentially a company that's allied, a country or an institution that's allied to the US or Europe or whoever can tender an instrument which can then fly. But without that framework, that's just not going to happen. Who are you?
Yeah.
Why should we? Secondly, Australia uses vast amounts of satellite data. The space sector is worth billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars to industry in terms of remote sensing, environmental monitoring, and I use this in my day job, which is in environmental sector, and things like protection of critical infrastructure. And all of that data comes from foreign satellites. Sometimes, particularly the US ones, not always reliable. So a couple of years ago, not the last government shutdown you had, but the one before, was right in the middle of our peak bushfire season. And one of our major early warning systems, bushfires, a system called Sentinel, which isn't raw data, which is just, could be collected from the satellite as it goes overhead. It was actually processed in the US and then sent over here. And we were deprived of that data because there was no one could legally process that and send it to us.
So you were Australia was dependent on the inner workings of the United States to be able to just get data for a national emergency there in Australia.
This sort of particular data. I mean, we were not totally dependent on it, and now there are Japanese satellites available. But I think it alerted the fact that while it's good to get free data, which other people have collected for you, it does make you vulnerable, and you are also dependent on the goodwill of that company or that country to continue to provide it for free. Thirdly, or another factor too, is the Australian environment is a bit different in terms of its soil chemistry and its vegetation type, and a lot of instruments on European or US or Japanese satellites aren't well tuned for Australian conditions. So this is why places like India have got very large Earth observation satellites of their own, which are attuned to their local environments. India actually has the largest civil Earth observation constellation of any country. And so there's awareness of opportunities. I think another factor too is things like CubeSats coming on. There's a bit of hype with CubeSats, but they certainly do provide many opportunities which are relatively cheap. And so we're no longer talking about satellites massing tons and costing hundreds of millions of dollars to put up. People could start putting up much cheaper satellites much more quickly. So a lot of things came together. National shame, awareness of vulnerability, and awareness that this was no longer a province of major entities, but
and Australia is in a great location because y'all are on the south side of the planet, and y'all have I think the Deep Space Network has that NASA runs has one of their stations there in Australia because of the location. It's located in a great spot, both longitudinally and help me out.
Latitude.
Latitude.
That's right. It fills in a gap. So the Tidbit tracking station, for example, is just 30 minutes down the road from me. At every time some visitor from comes and stays with us, I usually drag them out there. And it's a fantastic place to visit. The European Space Agency has a tracking station as well in Western Australia, part of their network. There are commercial tracking stations, communication satellites, and also hiring just to fill in gaps from larger networks. So we're well placed. Another thing is Australia, because of its location, actually has an international obligation to provide emergency services monitoring for things like maritime safety, aviation safety, communications, 1/8 of the Earth's surface. And we just don't have the capability to do that. We're relying on a few satellites from other countries, from I think European satellite, Japanese satellite, a Chinese satellite. That sort of helps us fill in the gaps. But yes, there's a bit of an embarrassment that when aircraft go missing in the Southern Ocean, that we often don't have the technical data or the raw environmental data to provide the necessary search and rescue. So a perfect storm came together. It was very interesting. I wasn't at the IAC in Adelaide when this was announced, but the acting industry minister made the speech, and he got a standing ovation. I don't think it's very often that any politician gets a standing ovation for announcing anything. So I think he was very touched by that because he had actually written the speech himself. We've got an election coming up. There's bipartisan support for this agency continuing. It's getting a little bit more money, so that's good. The person in charge is a former boss of mine, Dr. Clarke, a geologist by profession, and she's really excellent. She's got good scientific credentials. She has headed research organisations like the CSIRO in Australia before. She's worked for a venture capital company. so she understands the startup environment very well. So we expect good things. She's also very
Let me ask you a
supportive.
quick question. I'm sorry. Um, just for people that are outside Australia, do y'all have a two party system similar to the United States, or how does the politics work, just on a very broad level?
Uh, we have a system that has a little bit of similarity with the US and also some similarity with the UK. It's a parliamentary system.
Okay,
We have a governor general who's head of state. We elect parties. Then the party chooses the prime minister. Of the largest, the winning party chooses a prime minister. There are two major parties. There's a number of smaller parties of varying degrees of peculiarity who can sometimes be important in terms of numbers.
gotcha.
But yeah, we have them every 3 years, and compulsory is voting, which is sort of a Australian peculiarity.
That's right.
But just getting back to the space agency.
Yes, sir.
It's very, very important that we do have this bipartisan support. So that's encouraging. Megan Clarke is supportive of human spaceflight, and she can see the attractiveness of scientific exploration. But at the moment, given their very limited funding, the main focus on both is not human spaceflight as a means of going to Mars or back to the moon or whatever, but rather that this is a platform by which we can develop new medical instruments, potentially new drugs and so on, which can be commercialized. And the planetary exploration is an opportunity for people to develop new instrumentation, which can then have a terrestrial application. A classic example, which is the Terra instrument, which NASA developed for the Curiosity rover. It's part of the SAM package. It's on the Curiosity mission. This is commercially available as a Terra, and mining companies, various police forces and so on, use these instruments for chemical and mineralogical or crystallographic analyses. So there's interest in that. But of course, I think it was Administrator Griffin, several administrators ago of NASA, once gave a very interesting talk, and you can find it on the internet somewhere, about real and acceptable reasons for space exploration. The real reasons is because we want to go to Mars, because we want to go to the moon, we want to do visionary things, expanding human presence throughout the solar system and the universe. But the acceptable reasons are, of course, the commercial application, the strategic necessity, and so on. And so we come up with these fig leaves to justify the real reasons.
Fair enough. I mean, it happens everywhere, right?
Yes. And just finally on that, in terms of the Mars Society Australia, we had a meeting earlier this year, a few months ago, where we're talking about building the Mars Oz Station, which would be our equivalent of MDRS. And there was a representative from the space agency there taking part in our discussion. So they are, in principle, supportive of what we do and are happy to enable us if there are opportunities there. But of course, they can't give us any money at this stage because they don't have any. But it's good compared to a situation 5 years ago when there was no official interest whatsoever, to have people who are at least on our side now batting for us at the highest levels.
Yeah, well, it's always good to have a good working relationship with people who are in the government, regulators, and people that might be able to help make things happen, not only on a national level, but internationally, right?
Yeah, and I'm not sure how many other people can say that they've had a hug from the head of a national space agency, but Megan and I have worked together for many years, and a lot of that time she was my boss, so she's a fantastic person.
Awesome.
That's great.
Well, thanks so much. That was really interesting. So, moving to the next story here, we have two incidents that have happened over the past 2 weeks that have kind of left SpaceX reeling a bit. The first is the loss of the center booster used and successfully landed on the Falcon Heavy Arabsat 6A launch. So they were able to land all three boosters. They even recovered the two fairing halves for the first time. But when, of course, I Still Love You, the drone ship that the Center Core landed on in the Atlantic Ocean, was coming back to port with the booster, it encountered some really heavy waves. And while they have some sort of mechanism to stabilize the rocket boosters, it wasn't compatible with the Block 5 center core of a Falcon Heavy. It was designed really for Falcon 9 boosters. And so the heavy or the large waves tipped over the rocket. They lost half the rocket, and then the other half was very badly damaged. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, the real humdinger that everyone has been talking about is that Crew Dragon recovered from the Crew Demo 1 mission that went to the ISS and was the first step on getting crew rated or getting crew from U.S. soil back to space and the International Space Station specifically. It was leading up to NASA's return to flight. Had the understatement of a year, which was the Anomaly. And the Anomaly resulted in an explosion that, as far as I could tell from watching the video footage, just as my personal viewpoint, was it resulted in the complete loss of the vehicle. And we won't show that footage here on the podcast, just out of respect of copyright for the people that own that video. But one thing I can say is that it looked pretty dire. As if that happened while crew was in there, that would have been a really bad day.
Well, we still don't know for sure what happened, Christopher. That
Yeah,
footage, we don't know if it's verified. It's
fair
not
enough.
verified. And so, but yeah, there definitely was some type of large explosion. And the explosion had red smoke, which was an indication of the chemicals used in the recovery system on the Crew Dragon. So there's some type of, pretty bad anomaly that to this, I mean, it's almost been a week now, and we still haven't heard anything concrete about what happened, other than they're looking into it and they've begun an investigation.
All right, so
So
we haven't heard from uh, Gwen Stockwell. We haven't heard from Elon Musk. We haven't heard from Jim Bridenstine, the director of NASA. We haven't heard much of anything from anybody. Now, this is as of April 25th, which is when we're recording this right now, which does suggest, I think, a major issue that they're being so silent right now. But I also think that they're trying to make sure to investigate it, and when they come out, that they actually have facts to come out with. That they're not just
yeah,
creating more speculation out there.
right.
Now, go without going into too much speculation. What do we think the implications are? There's probably at least a minimum guaranteed implication for at least SpaceX's crewed space flight, if not more broadly, what's going on for NASA in general. What do we think about that?
Yeah, I think that we can probably assume that the crewed mission will be delayed, possibly into 2020. You
I've heard
know,
at least until 2020.
yeah, we don't know what the issue was exactly, and how long it's going to take for them to fix it and feel comfortable about the fix. But that will probably impact that upcoming mission, because that wasn't far off.
Yeah, that was
Um,
just going to be a couple months from now.
right. So there's that. I think that depending on how bad this is, it could have other impacts for SpaceX. Downstream, uh, and we just kind of have to see. I don't think it will affect NASA's overall programs to, for example, return to the moon, send cargo to the moon. Certainly, Boeing is also working on its crewed spacecraft for returning Americans to the ISS from U.S. soil.
Yeah, they just had actually their Starliner. They did a test where it was in the water, and they had a crew practice going out and rescuing astronauts if they needed rescue, and knowing how to operate the craft and all that. Boeing did.
Right. So I don't think it's going to have a major impact on NASA overall, because there's so many different suppliers they have now, which is awesome.
Yeah.
but it is going to be a big deal for SpaceX and getting that Crew Dragon flying, which, you know, for a lot of people, myself included, that's I'm really rooting for SpaceX in all this. They do some really amazing engineering work, and the Crew Dragon is a great piece of hardware that has usefulness for various missions beyond low Earth orbit.
Agreed. Jonathan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I mean, one of the um, you mentioned a video, which of course anyone can find on Google. But independent of that, you know, the other than the pictures of the huge billowing noxious cloud, I mean, the hydrazine and derivatives, nitrogen tetroxide, are extremely toxic and carcinogenic. And I think they can only do these sort of tests where there's a chance of an accident when the wind's blowing it out to sea. And in fact, there's a radar, again, you can find on Google, there was a weather radar showing this
I
dense,
will show that. I will show that on
yeah,
the podcast.
particulate cloud. Obviously, it's got large droplets of chemical nasties sort of blowing off from that,
Yeah.
which is rather alarming. So certainly a massive release, which really can only be a catastrophic failure. But my only real comment as we read the tea leaves, and that's all we're doing at the moment, is there's a forthcoming cargo dragon going to the International Space Station in the next few weeks, and that launch still seems to be going ahead. So that would suggest that the failure uh, is something to do with the systems that are unique to the Crew Dragon, probably the propulsion system, which again is consistent with the chemical release and so on. So the Cargo Dragon missions can seem to be going ahead without a problem. But yeah, I mean, you know,
In fact,
6 months.
there was an article that came out within the last day or two that explicitly said from I don't remember if it was NASA or if it was from SpaceX, but it explicitly said that the reason why they were comfortable with going ahead with the cargo mission was because the cargo dragon, the Dragon 1, doesn't have
Yeah.
the same systems that were affected by the anomaly. So,
And that's a really good sign for SpaceX. I mean,
well, I mean that's how they're making their money. Not only, but that's a big part of how they make their money. So that's important for them.
In the short term, it's not as bad as if a Falcon had blown up on the pad, because that would have set things back, both cargo and crew, for an indefinite period, as happened last time. Whereas at least this way, it's one system which is not yet operational, and you want to find these sort of problems before you actually put people on it.
Well, it's why you do the tests, right? It's why they did
Exactly, yeah.
the demo mission, and then they did these tests afterwards, right?
Yeah, and no one died, and that's really important.
yeah.
Agreed. So, I think I wanted to extend this conversation just a little bit because, in addition to the implications on SpaceX, you know, one of the things that I think it has made me think about is how, you know, a lot of people have had a lot of criticism for the SLS and the Orion spacecraft, including here at the Mars Society, and I know Dr. Zubrin has been quoted as saying, or at least to paraphrase what he said, you know, that we don't need Orion, we don't need the Lunar Gateway or toll booth, as he would put it. We just needed the Crew Dragon to go straight to the lunar surface. And to me, a counterpoint to that point of view would be, well, look, if there's a failure in one system, such as the Crew Dragon, you at least have the Starliner and the Orion spacecraft, or if there's a failure in one of those, you have some redundancy there in having multiple different systems that are capable of doing what you're trying to do. And maybe there's actually some value there that at least I hadn't considered before.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's awesome that we're going to have multiple options for sending crew to space. You know, unlike in the Apollo days, when the Apollo 1 fire happened, it set that program back at least a year and a half. And so we're not going to have to, if we have a sustained set of missions going out and there's just some type of failure like this, you know, the missions go on. And so it's great, robust architecture that we're building.
And we've seen this already with the International Space Station. I mean, it's been up there for nearly 20 years.
Right.
And in that time, we've seen multiple failures of the various supply craft that take supplies and people.
Well, last
With
year was
space
pretty
shuttle
bad for
failure.
that.
That's right, with a space shuttle failure, with a Soyuz launch failure, two Progress, a Dragon. But because of the redundancy with multiple providers of transport to and from the station, things have gone ahead without being too fraught for the people on board. And you shouldn't have too many eggs in one basket.
Diversify, just like with your finances. I am not a consultant. Don't listen to me.
Exactly.
Okay. All right, guys. So let's talk about NASA has established an independent planetary protection review board. It is chaired by Alan Stern, who was the PI for the principal investigator, to be clear, for the New Horizons spacecraft that went by Pluto and then Ultima Thule. Reporting the Planetary Protection Review Board will report directly to NASA's Science Mission Directorate Associate Administrator Thomas Zurbuchen. Zurbuchen, thank you. I don't know why y'all chose me for the host. I can't say anything worth a darn. But based on recommendations from the National Academy of Sciences, NASA's Advisory Council, and the science leadership within NASA itself. The board will update biological contamination guidelines developed by the Committee on Space Research, also known as COSPAR, and that was started in the late 50s and early 60s, and then has been updated periodically since then, but has pretty much stayed the same since then. It's been very strict to boot. They are charged with protecting Earth life from contaminating other worlds, and other worlds' life, if they do exist, from harming the Earth's biosphere, while balancing scientific, social, and economic goals of both public and now private space missions, such as Bereshit, or if SpaceX or some other company wanted to send something to the moon or Mars or wherever. Now, current protocols are quite strict, as I said. For example, the Curiosity rover can't search for life because it's not sterilized. And James, you were talking about this while we were preparing for this podcast. So I'll let you take that one a little bit further. So
Yeah.
give us the specific example of Curiosity rover, and then give us a broader view of what we think about this update.
Yeah. So it's important for planetary protection rules that all of the missions that go to Mars are sterilized, or their instruments are sterilized. In the case of the Curiosity rover, it's so large you can't sterilize the whole thing, but they were planning to sterilize the instruments so that if they would, if there was any life on Mars, we wouldn't get it confused with Earth life. So because that wasn't able to be done, I think they had some problem with the sterilization of the drill and some of the robotic arm. Because it's not sterilized, if they see anything like standing water or possible fossils, they actually have to drive away from that. So for the next rover, the Mars 2020 rover, it is going to have a more specific mission portfolio to try to find life and evidence of life, and so it won't have this problem, and hopefully they will be able to use some new instruments on that rover that have been sterilized to do some good detection.
So, Jonathan, why is it important, in your opinion, that we have these protocols? I can think of a couple of things, but why don't you tell us what your thoughts are on that?
Well, there are multiple reasons. I mean, the two of them you've mentioned already. One, we don't repeat bad past mistakes on Earth where we have gone somewhere and we have released organisms at all scales, which have then wreaked havoc for local environments. And of course, the problem with Mars is we don't know whether there are environments there. So we have to be careful until we can say there are none. And history is full of examples. The introduction of diseases, human diseases in new continents, and invasive species and so on. So it may be an exaggerated risk. Mars is a very, very hostile environment, a very different environment to Earth. Most terrestrial bugs would struggle to survive on most parts of Mars, even in the subsurface. And likewise, Martian bacteria or microbes, if they exist, would outcompete most terrestrial ones. So, yes, sometimes this risk is exaggerated, but we don't want to be cursed by future generations for want of due care. And of course, coming back, I mean, you only have to look at half a dozen horror movies to see how people, the general public, rely or react to the idea of perhaps something coming back from Mars that isn't properly contained or sterilized and potentially infecting Earth, even though the same arguments about Martian life really wouldn't like Earth. We are far too extreme in a whole range of parameters for Martian life to be happy here, and terrestrial life will mostly outcompete it. But like everything else, we're very bad with existential risk. So, a degree of precaution is certainly politically, as well as scientifically and strategically warranted. The third reason is that robotic instruments are incredibly limited. I mean, we talk about how wonderful they are, and they are, but we don't want the instruments we take to Mars to be contaminated by terrestrial materials, so they are assembled in clean rooms and carefully cleaned. We don't want life detection instruments we take them there to be actually hosting biological contaminants, which will upset the instruments. I mean, on Earth, we work with contaminated environments all the time, and we work around them, but we have tons of equipment and we've got different sampling techniques. Robotic missions are very, very limited in what they can do. And of course, you're working with them at the end of a time lag.
And there's no human there to just make a judgment on the spot to say, okay, well, instead of doing it this way, maybe I can do it that way, and just that adaptability.
Exactly. So again, we want to make sure the instruments are clean. And so, for example, most people listening to this podcast know about this debate over Mars methane. And the Curiosity rover has detected Mars methane and seems to be seasonally variable, which is very exciting. But there are certain skeptics who say, well, the problem is that the instrument has within it terrestrial air, and maybe the methane signals actually coming from the sealed compartments from Earth. It's Florida air that we're seeing the methane is, and compared to the amount of methane we might be detecting on Mars, there is a lot of methane in the atmosphere of Earth. So this, we're already encountering this issue, and this affects not only planetary protection but instrument design and so on. So hopefully, like with any environmental studies, once we actually know the parameters, certain things may become tighter, other things may become more relaxed. And the current attitude is that the surface of Mars is extremely hostile to life. Spacecraft don't have to be sterile; they just have to be clean, as we've heard already. Instruments, though, that are looking for life have to be sterilized. It's very difficult to sterilize spacecraft as a whole, and it's very expensive. A significant fraction of the cost of the Viking missions, some of the most expensive missions ever sent into space in current dollar terms, was to do with the fact they were actually heat sterilized at several hundred degrees. They were baked in a dry oven for hours, and that's a very difficult procedure. So surface of Mars is fine, but there may be special areas, as James has mentioned, where water might be seeping out. There might be areas where there's methane coming out, and there might be microbes either generating the methane or feeding off it. And these are called caves, another third possibility. These are called special areas where terrestrial life could survive and maybe Martian life is there. And they are off limits unless you're properly equipped to deal with that, to sample them in a sterile manner, in a clean manner, and so on. And we have experience with that on Earth. Every microbiologist
of which to remind people, you are a microbiologist, right?
No, I'm not a microbiologist. I'm an astrobiologist,
Astro.
means I'm a geologist who's interested in life off the Earth. But you pick up all sorts of things, and I worked with microbiologists, and you understand the sort of protocols they've got to go through to ensure non-contamination, to control that contamination. And another example on Earth, people going and working in a hot zone for Ebola. I mean, we can go and work safely in there and treat people who are ill and collect samples and without contamination. We also sampling things like ice, lakes underneath the ice in the Antarctic, which have issues almost as great as trying to sample life on Mars in terms of
We
preventing
don't want to
contamination.
contaminate that life, and we want to.
We don't want to contaminate that, and also we don't want to come back and say, oh look, it's full of these microbes which are they're very similar to the microbes in Washington or London or Moscow or whatever, whoever did the drilling, because they're contaminated, and there may well be life down there, but we just can't see a signal because it's been drowned out by the contamination, or maybe it's sterile and we just don't know. So there are certain people in the space enthusiast community, of which I'm one, who seem to think, well, we can go into space and we should sort of, full steam ahead and we shouldn't worry about rules. Well, the rules are already there, and life without rules, the rules are there for a reason. Life without rules is actually going to be bad for someone. So let's try and make sure, and this is what this committee is doing, let's see if the rules that currently work, if they need to be tightened or released or modified on the basis of new information. I mean, they were last modified over 20 years ago, I think, perhaps longer. And we've learned a lot about Mars since then. So let's wish them well.
It's a positive development. Like Jonathan said, there are people, and I'm one of them, that would kind of see this as somewhat of an obstacle of sending humans to Mars. There's definitely people that are involved with planetary protection that don't want to send people to Mars because we will contaminate Mars.
I know Dr. Zubrin has had a couple of different debates with people on that very subject, and I'm sure you could find at least one of them right here on the same channel.
Absolutely. And so the fact that they're looking at these rules and seeing what makes sense, and maybe making them less restrictive for humans to Mars, is a positive development.
Yeah. And again, the fact that the surface of Mars is so hostile, I think, and is recognized to be that, it means that we can land on Mars and work on Mars. Not necessarily, yes, there may well be bacteria that'll arrive there with us, but they're not going to thrive. And this raises a technical question, almost a philosophical question. What do we mean by contamination? I mean, the way some people carry on, one terrestrial bacteria on Mars has contaminated the entire planet. But does it? I mean, one crashed spacecraft, is that contaminated? So we really need to come to a practical definition. So, if someone driving a fuel tanker has an accident down the road and there's an oil spill, yes, it's contaminated that area, but the whole continent of Australia, let alone the whole Earth, is not contaminated by that one spill. So, and we then have to try and remediate it. So when we send people to Mars, we've got to think about what level of contamination is acceptable. Just like when we wash our dishes, right? No dishes are ever completely clean; they're just acceptably dirty. So, what is an acceptable level of contamination around a human landing site that allows us to protect Mars, allows us to protect our crew, allows us to work with scientific integrity, to utilize the resources necessary. And just like on Earth, there'll be areas where we can't go, we can't do certain things, and others where we can. And I think it's a very valuable exercise to go through.
I'm all about being intentional. I know there has been the argument, though, that it can be overzealous, and if there are microbes on Mars, they're not doing very well. It's not like they're creating a civilization over there right now, and the detriment of, at least at some point, if not immediately, going and living on Mars and creating a society on Mars and beyond, the benefits of that far outweigh any detriment that might be to microbes that are living on Mars, and the likelihood that we would be able to detriment all of the microbes that are living on Mars if they are there is just it's very lopsided.
Yeah, and
I think. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
it's a philosophical thing. It's like
Yeah, right.
some people believe that it's our duty to go to Mars and bring human beings to Mars and start a whole civilization there and terraform the planet and make it like a second Earth someday. And obviously, that's going to hurt the Martian bacteria if we do that. But if we go there and study them and comprehensively and learn everything we can about them, but then also go do that, go also turn it into another Earth. That's what we're supposed to do. That's a lot of people feel that way, and obviously that runs completely counter to planetary protection.
Well, I think that people, as you said, it's a philosophical question. I think there's a lot of sloppy philosophical language going around on this topic. I mean, people talk about the rights of bacteria, and I think that's nuts. On the other hand, there are bacteria have value, and particularly Martian bacteria. We have, especially if it turns out it's what we call a second genesis, that it's actually an independent life biosphere that's there, is completely different to Earth. I mean, who knows what we might learn from there. So they have value. So for example, the Mona Lisa has value. It has no rights. It's a painting. But if you wanted to use it as a floor rag, I mean, people would object, and rightly so. So I think we should avoid talk of rights when we're dealing with non-sentient life forms. But we can say they have value. The second thing is, certainly at the exploration stage, it's very hard to imagine anything we could do to Mars that's going to endanger Martian bacteria. I think there's a lot of hype about that. But these are tough little critters that are highly adapted, if they exist at all, which they may not.
Well, they would have to be to exist and be alive today.
Exactly. And I think it's very hard to think of, short of actually physically destroying their environment.
Well, I mean, I think you go back to that Mona Lisa example, or the example that you had. The Mona Lisa is important, and so we don't want to have people, putting their hands all over it and sneezing on it and all this stuff. So we don't make people not go to Paris and evacuate Paris to protect the Mona Lisa, right? We put some protections around it. We keep some distance between the humans and the painting itself, or if we do handle it, we handle it with gloves and in proper environments. And then we still allow humans in the Louvre to go and look at it and experience it and appreciate it. And people still live in Paris, and people still live in Europe and on the planet. It's not like we're going to say, well,
I think too, it would be very hard to do a decent, I say any kind of sophisticated biological research on Martian life, if it exists, without having people on the spot with tons of equipment and all of the flexibility that direct human presence can allow. I think too, James raised an interesting point about terraforming. I don't think bacteria, if they live, say, a kilometre below the Martian surface, really would really be impacted by any kind of terraforming we do. And the other thing too is, one possibility about Martian life, if it exists, is it's the last surviving relics of an earlier biosphere. If we made Mars more habitable, we actually may be making Mars more suitable for them. Back to the good old days when we could roam the surface freely. But before any of that happens, we've got to go there and find out whether or not there is life, and if there is, what's its nature, and how common is it, and where's it found, and so on. So we shouldn't sort of jump the gun too much about what might happen, unless we're writing a movie or a book or doing a movie. Then all the bets are off.
I think the movie that sticks out in my head is Species. Where the astronauts went over there and they came back infected, and so they start. It's a whole ridiculous thing, and I think a lot of layman people that aren't highly educated on Mars and space think that that might happen, and I'm sitting here trying to think, even if there is life that is somehow compatible with Earth life, let alone
Mm.
humans specifically, the likelihood of it being parasitic or something like that is just, you know, you you
Yes,
don't adapt to being a parasitic organism when there's nothing to be parasitic with.
exactly. Yeah, we generally don't get diseases from species that are not too closely related to us. There's a very interesting study that was done here in Australia about 10 years ago that the Mars Society Australia was involved in. We provided the willing victims for the survey. And it was done by a university in Western Australia, the Department of Public Health, and they wanted to, as an exercise of public perception of risk, um, they looked at whether or not people trusted NASA to safely bring samples from Mars back to Earth, an unmanned sample return mission.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things they found was that there was a very strong correlation between um, trust and how well informed people were. And this is why conversations like this are so important, that the more informed people were, even in a very general sense, the more likely to say, yes, these people doing this are highly competent, and they've looked at all the factors, and they don't want to release dangerous organisms on Earth any more than we would like that. And whereas if people are misinformed or just plain ignorant, then yeah, they look at movies like Species, or what was that one last year or the year before, Life or whatever,
Life. Yeah.
and uh, and and that's actually fair enough. I mean, if that's all they know, then it's a reasonable position one to take. So that's why, yeah, I think we're doing a very important thing here in getting the more informed perspective, hopefully, out to the broader community.
Yeah, we'll take a shot. You know, take a shot. All right, so NASA releases results of the Kelly twins study. So identical twins Scott and Mark Kelly, who are both or were both astronauts that both now retired, took part in a study where Scott spent a full year in space while his brother Mark remained here on the ground. Now, not on a first name basis with these guys. It's just to help differentiate them because they're both Kelly, another proper way of saying it, but you'll get the point. Now, telomeres, which are the protective ends of DNA, similar to the little plastic that's at the end of your shoelace, uh, the lengths of those expanded by about 15% while in space for Scott, and they returned back to what was considered normal for him. Very within a very short time of returning back to Earth. So that was really interesting. Another thing that they found was that there was a lot of damage and a restructuring or altering of DNA, likely radiation based or induced, and it was extensive and persistent. And it not only was happening while he was up there for the full year, but at least 6 months after he came back down, which 6 months was when they stopped testing and looking at these things, it was continuing to change and be damaged and be altered. Another thing that they found was Scott's immune activity was also affected. His microbiome, which is all the little critters and bugs and microbes that live on and in your body, we all have it. It changed significantly. They saw a lot of big changes in that, but at the same time, it didn't necessarily affect the how effective his immune system was. They actually gave him the flu vaccine while he was on the space station, and his body responded appropriately to that. So, while it was different than it was here on the ground, that doesn't mean that it was ineffective. They also tested his cognition abilities, and so while he was on the space station, they would run tests every once in a while to test, his ability to think and perform tasks. And he did actually better while he was on the space station than even when before he went up. But then after he landed, and for the 6 months that they tracked this stuff after he landed, it was actually reduced. Now, one of the things that we read in the articles that I read was that they thought that it could possibly be that his life was so structured and regimented on the space station that helped contribute to his high functionality, because you basically you get in the zone, or you get flow. And then while he was back here on Earth, he was able to relax, and then even if he had times of heightened activity going on that helped exercise his brain, if you will, it wasn't so regular that might be a cause besides the biological causes that could possibly be there. Excuse me. Now, these results, according to the study, should be taken with a grain of salt, as they are an N of one. There's only one pair of twins that they looked at, and so there's a lot of factors that could have gone wrong or could be unique to this situation. So until we have a larger sample set, we can't really generalize too much. But it does bode, and for some people it bodes well, and for other people it's like, well, that's a problem. But for space flight to on long duration space flights to like Mars and elsewhere. James, I'll let you start off. What are your thoughts about all of this? What did you see that was really particularly interesting to you?
Yeah, it's really interesting that the telomeres lengthened when he was in space, and those are thought to play a role in aging. And then they went back to normal, so to speak, after he returned. To me, the old study showed the plasticity of the human body, that it can adapt to different environments very well and then go back to normal. He did have some DNA damage that you mentioned. That could be from the cosmic ray doses he was getting. It could be from just zero gravity and the inherent nature of him being in zero G for that long, which we wouldn't necessarily do on a Mars mission. You might have artificial gravity on the way to Mars to prepare the crew. And also when they return back to Earth, kind of spinning up the ship to Earth gravity slowly to reacclimate them. I've a couple people sent me news articles that said, "Oh, look, this is bad for Mars because he had all this DNA and immune activity was affected." But then there's also an article I saw that said this is good for Mars because it shows the plasticity of the human body and that it can adapt to different environments. So, like you said, it's a very interesting study. It's just an N of one. There's just one set of twins that they've measured here. It just shows there's so much more research we need to do. I really want to see research with artificial gravity. I don't think there's enough of that happening right now. Way back in the
You got
day.
a second on that motion right here. So
Yeah, absolutely. Back in the day with the Mars Society, we were going to do the Mars Gravity Biosatellite mission and send some mice up into an Earth orbiting satellite, spin it up to Mars gravity, and see their effects. And similar experiments like that are being done on the Kibo module on the ISS, where they have some centrifuges. So I'm really interested to see stuff like that done more, and really seeing how taking the zero gravity part of it out, because I do think that is clouding some of these results. So, what are your thoughts, John?
Well, I read the paper yesterday, and I think the very cautious preliminary conclusions were that for periods space missions of this duration in zero gravity, things are looking quite positive. He adapted quite quickly up there. He functioned well. I mean, there are some interesting changes, and he seems to have adjusted very well to coming back. And with all the caveats, here we have a sample of one and so on. Another caveat, which I don't think anyone else has mentioned, but I mean, people go and stay in extreme environments all the time, but they're never monitored to this level. So if we were to take people who did a rotation on a missile submarine or something for 3 months cruise, or they spent a year in the Antarctic, or climbed Everest, so we've monitored them to this level, I mean, who knows what we might find. And there just isn't the money for that sort of thing. But if you read the accounts of people who go and winter at the South Pole, I mean, they have all sorts of very freaky physical changes, from the high altitude and the cold and so on. So I think it's quite doable. I do know that the human factors roadmap that NASA's drawn up says that within about 6 years, 7 years, they think they can actually sign off on all of the, through research on the ISS, on all of the human factors issues, including radiation and zero gravity and so on, to say, yeah, we can go to Mars. There's lots of interesting things. I just, this last week, there's a woman from NASA flying to the ISS and have just extended her mission to stay there for 320 days, so almost as long. And of course, half the population are female, so it'd be really good to get data on how women adapt. There's some suggestion they don't have the eye problems that men have, and so it's very important to get data there. Only 8 people so far have spent more than 300 days in space. Another observation, of course, is that when people go to Mars, they'll only be spending 6 months going there. They're not going to spend a year, and then they'll spend 18 months under Mars gravity, which is not insignificant, and then 6 months back. And people have already done equivalent missions. Back in the 70s, a Russian cosmonaut spent 6 months on Salyut 6. He came back. He was back up for the next crew that went up, but the primary, his counterpart in the primary call was dropped. And so after a few months on Earth, he went back into space for another 6 months. And he's now in his 70s and seems to be doing fine. So I think, as James said, humans are adaptable, and sometimes difficult, sometimes challenging, but compared to going to the Antarctic 100 years ago.
My takeaway is, there are some potential risks involved with space flight, and if nothing else, just the risk of cancer and things like that from radiation, a radiation environment that you're not normally exposed to, is higher. But at the same time, if you went and asked a lot of people, at least a significant portion of the population, is that risk worth it? I think a lot of people would say, yeah, it is. And so, there are factors that we need to take into account, and we should do everything we can to minimize risks. But at the same time, nothing about this study or any other study that's been done tells us that, we need to just back off of this and leave it to the robots.
That's right. The biggest risk in space flight is the launch and the landing. Everybody who's died on a space mission has been in those few minutes going up and the few minutes coming back. When you're actually in space, people seem to be able to deal with it. I mean, we've had fires, we've had collisions, we've had depressurization, we've had loss of attitude control, we've had loss of propulsion system leaks. There's an incredible litany of things that have gone wrong on space missions, which have been dealt with. The other thing too, we've spent years of cumulative space, or decades of cumulative spaceflight time, and there's only been 2, possibly 3 cases of people abandoning, cutting short a long-duration space mission because of health issues. Out of all of the cumulative years. And of course, the space stations today have had very limited medical facilities because you can evacuate people. Why try and treat people who are sick in Earth orbit when you can bring them home? So it's a pretty safe environment. And this brings something that people often don't realize. There's a difference between hazard and risk. I mean, crossing the road is a hazard. We can keep the risk at a safe level by, looking both ways, by using a pedestrian crossing, by making sure that we cross with the lights, not against them. And we make these choices all the time. And space flight's the same thing. There are many hazards, often very gruesome ones, like spacecraft exploding or whatever, as we've seen recently. But we bring the risk down to a level that we find acceptable. And it still is dangerous. I mean, it's going into space is one of the most dangerous things we can do, other than perhaps climbing Mount Everest. It's more dangerous going to a war zone for most people in the Western world. But nonetheless, we find the risks even for routine missions acceptable. So why, as long as Mars missions don't have a chance of dying greater than that, we should be all right. I've just got some numbers here from radiation because everyone worries about radiation. We've got a lot of data now. So if you spend a year on the International Space Station, you will get about 236 millisieverts, which is a dose equivalent, which allows us to compare the amount of dose received from different kinds of radiation. If you were to spend...
Can I actually help unpack that a little bit? For somebody like me that are watching this podcast that might not understand things as well, what is it was how much and what is that? What does it mean by a dose? What does that mean?
Sorry, and thank you for asking that. Okay, so we're all immersed in a radiation environment. We get cosmic rays from space. We've got radiation from rocks, from bananas, from coffee. Our own bodies are slightly radioactive, and this gives us a dose. And it's all sorts of different things. I mean, cosmic rays, alpha particles, gamma rays, all these sort of things. They all have different effects. And there's a unit called a sievert, which allows us to compare apples and oranges of the different kinds of radiation. And so it's a dose equivalent, it's called. And
so what is a dose equivalent equivalent to what?
Well, the dose equivalent means if you get a particular dose of neutrons, for example, or gamma rays, you can compare that with something a similar dose equivalent from cosmic rays or gamma rays or so on.
Okay, so it allows you to compare different types of radiation because there's electromagnetic and then there's actually like particles going through your body, things like that. Yep. Allows you to say, okay, this amount of gamma rays is equivalent to that amount of alpha particles versus, okay.
Exactly.
I gotcha.
The space radiation is complicated as well. You've got cosmic rays from who knows where, zipping through.
Outside of the interstellar, outside of the
intergalactic space.
Yeah. Right. Could be supernovas from another galaxy that are the source of those cosmic rays.
Exactly. And then we've got solar particles. And when they interact with the spacecraft structure, they generate X-rays and so on. So again, we use a dose equivalent. So if you spend a year on the space station, the International Space Station, and this is from published research, you'd get about 236 millisieverts, thousandths of a sievert, basically essentially a quarter of a sievert a year. If you were to run around naked in skinny little Mars, in Gale Crater, right, for a whole year, assuming
we're going streaking
on Mars,
going down to the crater,
you would get essentially the same dose.
Okay.
So, and of course, you never do that because you'd actually be living most of the time in a well-shielded habitat, probably as well shielded as the International Space Station. And when you're going out, you'd be wearing a spacesuit, you'd be in a pressurized rover a lot of the time. So we are already exposing astronauts to equivalent doses, greater than doses than they would get on Mars. And there are people who've clocked up Mars equivalent doses, Mars mission equivalent doses, who are now in their 70s. People who flew to Salyut 6 and Salyut 7 in the 70s and 80s.
That's a great piece of information. Thank you for that. That's amazing to know.
And here's a really interesting thing. There are places on Earth that have very high background radiation, and people are very interested in these. So there's a place in Iran called Ramsar where people get 400 millisieverts, almost twice what you get on the International Space Station a year. And they live out normal life. There's no sign of any ill effects or no conclusive evidence of ill effects of either cancer or whatever. There's a tourist resort in Brazil called Guarapari Beach where people get 788 millisieverts a year. I mean, that's more than 3 times what the International Space Station grew. And people go there for their holidays. I mean, people go to Ramsar because it's on the Caspian Sea for holidays as well. But, Guarapari Beach has skyscrapers, and people go there for the holidays, and there's people who work there all year round. And there's a beautiful valley in France, of the Lodive Valley, where people get 875 millisieverts in some areas. And again, some of the plants that live there are starting to look a bit odd. But they're not triffids or anything, but they're starting to show some damage. But background radiation, low levels or even moderate levels of background radiation does seem to be less harmful than the linear models that people use suggests.
Well, that's good to know. Okay.
The one piece of this, though,
ahead,
one last point before we move on. I mean, the one piece about a humans to Mars mission that I think we do have to worry a little bit about is the interplanetary cruise from Earth to Mars. The ISS is getting some cosmic ray doses, but they're only getting half of what an interstellar flight would get because the Earth is shielding them from the other half
it's
of the
still in the
universe.
magnetic field of the Earth.
Yeah. Well, no, also because the Earth's in the way of the whole other half of the universe
fair
that
enough.
cosmic waves are coming from. So when they're out in the interstellar medium between Earth and Mars, or the interplanetary medium between Earth and Mars, they're going to get that full dose of cosmic rays, which there's not much we could do about. Solar flares, the other kind of dangerous radiation, those would come from the sun, but you get a little bit of warning from those, and you could like go into a small safety area inside of the middle of the ship or whatever. But cosmic rays are going to be coming at you all the time. So that is one area that is a little dangerous, which is why it's important that we try to reduce the amount of flight time between Earth and Mars to minimize that cosmic ray dose.
I know I am aware of several different organizations or people or students researching things like this, where people are also researching different ways that we could protect against that kind of thing, with magnetic fields and passive plating, and where you put your water storage, all of these kinds of things, because all of those things, if you put water between you and space, and you put an electromagnetic field between you and space, and certain plating that has certain properties because of the elements and the molecules that are in there, those are all going to help protect. It might not be 100%. It might not be like living here on the surface of the Earth, but again, it will be hopefully acceptable. And certainly, I would think to the people that are going on a Mars mission, it's not like they're going to be completely unaware of this, right? They're going to be going into it knowing that that's going to be a possibility, and make the determination that it's worth it.
Right.
Yeah, very much so. And so, for example, good design, and James referred to this as well, where you plan, I think you did, where you place spacecraft components has a huge impact. So the Columbus module on the International Space Station has roughly 30 grams per square centimeter of shielding just from the hull, from tanks, from laboratory equipment, and so on. And that's huge. That will shield you from just about everything the sun can spit out. And this module is the one that had 236 millisieverts a year radiation. An instrument on the outside of the International Space Station had almost twice that. So you can cut radiation doses simply by good design without actually having dedicated shielding to about half. 1 year in deep space from the instrument that went to Mars on the Curiosity rover was 660 millisieverts a year. That was slightly shielded because it was actually inside the heat shield of the lander. And that was, the shielding there is only about 8 grams per centimeter squared, which is the same as the Apollo module. So I think we could probably get it down to at least half that just by good design. And of course, if you can cut your travel time to 2/3 that, 4 months there and 4 months back, then that's quite substantial.
But bottom line, this is not a reason not to go.
Right? No, I think if you got about a sievert over the period of a Mars mission, which is a lot more than these numbers actually add up to, you would have about a 5% chance of dying, greater chance of dying of cancer. What does that mean?
At some point later in your life.
Yes, 20% of the population dies of cancer anyway, right? That's the reality. We're all going to die of something, and 20% of us are going to die of cancer. So if we send
and a small aside, screw cancer, by the way, but
yeah, so we send 100 people to Mars and have a popular, and 100 people stay behind. On average, 20 of the people who stay behind will die of cancer. On the people who go to Mars and come back, 25 of them are going to die of cancer. I mean, it's far less dangerous than smoking, for example.
All right. Well, so I do want to move on. So we're going to go to Bridgestone Corporation, which is teaming up with Toyota and Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency, known as JAXA, on a crewed moon rover. So they are planning in 2029 to have a 5-year mission of a crewed rover that will be launched on an American rocket. It's actually a quite large rover that they're planning. And so it's 6 meters long, 5.2 meters wide, 3.8 meters tall. It has 13 square meters of living space inside. And the announcement is that Bridgestone is joining to help create the tires, or really the whole wheels that will provide the appropriate support and traction that they're going to need on the lunar surface. But I found that really cool that JAXA is planning on doing this rover mission, and it sounds it's just as exciting to me this as the plans that NASA recently announced and all these other things that we're hearing about. So, what do y'all think?
I love it. Bridgestone, I see their commercials a lot, and the Apollo crewed moon rover had wire mesh wheels. I'm curious to see what they designed for this, and it's just exciting that more and more hardware is being built for a human return to the moon.
Yeah, and there's been some videos floating around of someone, I think in the US, who's come up with a more recent version of those wire mesh wheels that they're even more flexible, more reliable, which is fantastic. And of course, Toyota are the premier builder of four-wheel drive vehicles on the planet, so it's really good getting their input into such a vehicle. Sometimes when aerospace engineers design vehicles, they end up in some rather strange places. So I think it's good to have automotive
over design
and unusual solutions, shall we say, to that. I mean, it was interesting the Soviet experience with the Lunokhod, the first off-Earth robotic rovers. I mean, they went through all sorts of early designs by aerospace engineers, and they eventually went to military vehicle design bureau and said, well, how would you design it? And they came up with a design that was uniquely lunar, but nonetheless drew on lessons from heavy trucks and light off-road vehicles and so on. And one of the reasons why those vehicles were very successful and the rovers were very, very successful was that.
There you go. All right, so we're going to move on to honorable mention news. So this is going to be like a lightning round. So I'm just going to go through the different news stories. There's a ton of them. We just don't have the time to break down every single one of them. If we have some comments, we can, but we're just going to kind of move through them relatively quickly here. So first off is Blue Origin will test BE-3U and BE-4 rocket engines on test stand 4670 at NASA Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. After the stand is upgraded and refurbished by Blue Origin, the engines are being considered for the exploration upper stage in competition with Boeing, who is, I think, the current contractor for that stage. So that's big news, certainly for Blue Origin. It helps spread diversify the pool of contractors that you're working with at NASA, and it's also brings new rocket engines into the plethora that are out there to be able to pull from for different designs.
Yeah, the BE-4 is a huge engine. It's analogous to the F1 engines on the Saturn V. And so I know that those engineers were studying some of the ones here at the Seattle Museum of Flight. It's like you said, Christopher, it's great to see different hardware being built and different options for NASA to put onto the exploration upper stage.
Agreed. So the first Earth-sized planet discovered by TESS, which is a mission that we sent out, like a year ago now, or maybe a little bit more than a year ago. It's going to survey. It's the follow up to the Kepler satellite, and so it's going to survey the entire sky over the period of a couple of years. So right now it's looking at the southern hemisphere of our sky, and its first Earth-sized planet was discovered 53 light years away on an orbital period of only 8 days. So that planet goes around its star pretty quick. The planet is estimated to be about 89% the diameter of Earth. So I thought that was a really cool story. Tons of planets out there, and we're really just now starting to realize, wow, planets are kind of a thing in the universe.
They're everywhere. I can't wait till we find the Earth analog, and then that's going to be a high priority destination.
Oh yeah, I heard somebody quote on Twitter, "We will be an interstellar civilization within the next 100 years," and I absolutely, there's no reason not to believe that. Let me put it to you this way: it would be a crime if we're not, because there's no reason we shouldn't be. A Russian division of PepsiCo, Adrenaline Rush, an energy drink aimed at gamers, has partnered with a Russian company, Start Rocket, to use CubeSats launched in orbit to create an orbital billboard. Now, Scott Manley, who is a YouTuber and does a lot of rocket and space news stories, one of my favorite guys, got me into Kerbal Space Program myself. He said, I'm not too much into anti-satellite technology, but for this, I might change my mind. Obviously,
Yeah,
I
I
think he
second
was
that.
saying that in a bit in jest. Now, once PepsiCo headquarters in the United States got wind of this story, I surmised that they shut it down pretty quick, because within just a few days of that announcement, a spokesman was quoted in a Space News article as saying that Pepsi had no further plans to test or commercially use this technology at this time. So they're not going to be doing that like they had originally thought. And
Yeah,
it was pretty unpopular.
yeah.
Tacky
I
is
think
the word I'd
it does
use.
raise a big question with CubeSats. I mean, I've been to space conferences where in one room people are enthusiastically talking about constellations of satellites, of thousands of satellites in each constellation, tens of thousands in some case, quite unaware that in the next room, people are concerned about the problem of space debris, and you think, come on, guys, talk to each other about this problem, because space debris is an issue. The satellites have been lost already because of this, and we don't want to make it. We don't want to become
Later
earthbound.
down the list here, I'll actually talk about one.
Yeah, good.
So it also brings up something, out of New Zealand, Star Lab. I'm sorry, Rocket Lab, the Electron rocket. In 2018, they launched the Humanity Star, which was actually the only purpose of the Humanity Star was it was a satellite that was supposed to remind humanity of how great we are, or something like that. And it wasn't as bright as they expected it to be, but it was basically a space billboard, and it did get some criticism even back then
Yeah, yeah.
for that. So, all right, moving on. 2024 moonshot update. Um, uh, so they were supposed to. They got a. NASA has to give Congress a budget, and the 2024 announcement by Vice President Pence was so late in the game that NASA didn't have a chance to implement that program in their current budget to submit to Congress to then go and pass a budget. When when Jim Bridenstine went and testified in front of Congress, he said, "Well, I'll get that to you." The technical date was supposed to be April 15th, which is tax day here in America. That didn't happen, but it is quoted as being it should be ready either later this month in April or sometime in early May. So in the next couple of weeks, that should be coming out, certainly within 4 weeks. And so that will be something to be on the lookout for. So it's going to have a lot of implications on the politics around the whole program, and then also the specifics of what are the priorities of NASA. Are there any programs going to be cut? Those kinds of things, which a lot of people are worried about and concerned about.
Rightly so. They're definitely going to ask for more money for NASA overall, but the exact impact to non-moon programs is really, like you said, a lot of people are worried about. They are going to need to get the exploration upper stage funded somehow to meet that schedule of 2024, and so we'll see. I'm really curious to see how they plan to approach that in this budget update.
When I don't think that story we talked about earlier about a Blue Origin is completely unrelated. I think there's some there. That the reason that they approved that instead of just going with Boeing is that look, Blue Origin can get this done, then that's the way we're going to go. Interstellar. Oh, go
The
ahead.
engine is a huge exercise. Any of these really large engines, it doesn't really matter who does it and what approach they use. It's generally 5 to 10 years to get them working. I mean, the Saturn F1 is a classic one. The RD-170, the most powerful thing ever built, took about 7 years to get. I mean, SpaceX have been playing around with Raptor for 6 or 7 years, so they've finally got to the point where it's giving maximum thrust. So it's not something you want to rush. I mean, any rocket development has explosions and other things. And
all right. So my point would be though is sometimes what that sort of thing is, it's just like I have a scene in my head from the movie 13 Days.
This isn't a blockade. This is language, a new vocabulary, the likes of which the world has never seen. This is President Kennedy communicating with Secretary Khrushchev.
It's a way for NASA to say to Boeing and other contractors, look, if you're not going to get this done on a timely basis in a budget, then we might just go with somebody else. Even if
I think that,
and I think that's really, to me, that's the most significant part about it from a political point of view, beyond the technical and engineering aspects of it.
I think that's quite bad. That's quite fair enough. Yeah.
All right, so an interstellar visitor to Earth, that's right, you heard me right, was actually found, or at least after the fact. Apparently a meteor from 2014 that came and actually entered Earth's atmosphere. It has been tracked back to have an interstellar origin in a paper by Amir Siraj, and forgive me if I'm not pronouncing these right, and Abraham Loeb. The paper has yet to be peer reviewed, but I think it's a significant thing. It's really cool. I mean, it was just not, but a couple years ago with Oumuamua, which was the first detected interstellar visitor to the solar system, and now we got one that it didn't just come into the solar system; it came straight to Earth, which transpermia and all kinds of other implications to that, which is not surprising. On the one hand, it's like, well, I could have guessed that that's happened before. But on the other hand, it's kind of cool that we actually have data to support that this has happened.
Absolutely.
Purdue, which is in Indiana, it's a university here in America, chosen by NASA as the site for a new Space Habitat Research Institute. And so that's, I think, big news. And Nora, one of the producers on the show, she's there. So I think she's going to be happy to hear about that. So that's really cool that they're starting to really think about space habitats, research different methods, that kind of thing, which is going to be important for a lunar base, for a Mars base, and elsewhere.
Yeah, we're going to have hopefully some folks from Purdue at our conference this year in October at USC, where we are going to have a Mars analog research symposium as part of our conference.
Right.
And so, I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what they're planning to do with this new Space Habitat Research Institute at Purdue.
Oh, man, we'll definitely be paying attention to that. So ULA, which is a rocket company, Vice President of Production Operations and Supply Chain, Cindy Nafas, has been named 2019 Woman of Impact by Yellowhammer News, which is an Alabama newspaper, or I say newspaper, news organization. It's all online nowadays. So that was pretty significant, and kudos to her. She has done quite a good job there at ULA. NASA chooses SpaceX to launch Moon, a satellite. No, I wrote that wrong. I should have done it. So they're going to launch a mission to Moon, which is a satellite of a near-Earth asteroid, Didymus, and it'll be an impact mission. And so they're going to send something to impact it to see if they can knock it away. It's to research, if an asteroid is coming for Earth, what impact can we have? No pun intended there. On moving the impactor out of Earth's trajectory, and they're going to have basically a bunch of telescopes pointed at it from Earth to see what happens. So, when in doubt, hit it with the hammer, right?
Yeah. What could possibly go wrong?
I think absolutely nothing. There's can't possibly. All right,
I
so
couldn't resist.
What's that?
I couldn't resist it.
No, it was great. I love it. We gotta have a little bit. Okay, so Bereshit, the moon lander that Israel Space IL out of Israel sent to the moon. The lander just took this final shot, and as us Kerbal Space Program players affectionately call it, before it lithobraked on the surface of the moon. So it was a really cool shot. It's really close, about as close as you can get without actually being on the surface. And since we did our last episode, they have announced that the cause of the failed landing attempt was traced back to erroneous command sent to the craft from the ground. So sorry for whoever that guy or gal was. But because of the limits of the craft's thrust capabilities, combined with the constant acceleration due to the lunar gravity well, by the time they had regained control of the craft, it was just traveling too fast to be stopped. It's like trying to slam on your brakes before you hit the car in front of you, and you just don't have enough distance between you and the car in front of you before the car would actually stop. The stopping distance is just longer than the distance you actually had.
I was watching this live, and I remember I could just see the numbers. The amount of velocity they had towards the moon was so high. They had lost control of the engine, and then they regained it. Everyone in the room clapped when they regained it, but I could tell it was going to be too late. And sure enough,
it was beyond the contingency parameters that they had set up in that craft. And every engine has a limit on how much force it can throw out the back end of the craft, and it just didn't have enough force to stop in time. If they had more distance, if the same thing had happened, but it had happened earlier in the mission, they might have been able to stop it. But it just that the closer you get to the surface, the higher the gravity, the higher the acceleration, the more critical it is to have your velocity under that critical amount. In any case, they did receive the X Prize, as we talked about last time, of $1 million, and they have announced that they will indeed build Bereshit 2 and give it another go. And one of the founders, those three guys that were in the pub, he was quoted as saying, one of the things that he wants to make sure that young people that are watching this know is that it's important that failure is not really an end state. It is simply a way, a thing that happens on your way to success. And so you don't stop at failure. You learn from it, and you keep on going. And so that was one of the messages that they want to send out, and I can second that message myself.
That's a great message.
First you don't succeed, try again. All right, 2019 CG6 is an asteroid that was detected, a near-Earth object. It passed within about 20 No, it is about 20. I was like, that's too close. It is about 20 meters in diameter, and it passed very close to Earth at around 6:41 UTC on April 18th. And it was not detected till just days before the encounter. So it's just another example of, there are lots of threats out there that we may not know about, so we might want to, get on that. CRS-17, the SpaceX mission to the ISS, is scheduled for tomorrow. That is basically, it's the first Dragon, the cargo Dragon that's going to resupply the ISS. So if you, by the time you're watching this podcast from us, it will have already happened. You can go check that out. NASA accelerates pace of core stage production of SLS with a new tool. So they basically they are accelerating how quickly they're going to get the SLS out there, and so that was a good development, and obviously part of the 2024 moonshot there.
Yeah, Jim Bridenstine championed them getting this new tool to be able to work on the SLS while it's laying down the core stage. And so it's just another example of how serious NASA is about the moonshot in 2024, and they're doing everything they can to get the SLS done because it's in the critical path for that.
Right, and for to just explain a little bit, so you got a rocket here, but it's divided up into different stages, and some rockets they are assembled, like the space shuttle, or I think ULA is assembled vertically, so in a VAB, a vehicle assembly building. But then, like SpaceX, they assemble their rockets horizontally, and what's going on is the SLS part of it is being assembled horizontally, and that's now thanks to this tooling. While they're also working on a section that was only designed to be assembled vertically. And so that new tooling, the new equipment that they have is going to make it to where they can build things concurrently, and they don't have to wait for this stage to be done before they can start on that stage.
And that'll good project management. Faster.
Agreed. Okay, Neil Armstrong's spacesuit goes back on display at the National Air and Space Museum. They had taken it out. They've cleaned it off and done things to help ensure that it stays for future generations. Not a huge story as far as the impact of going to Mars, but I think significant and applaud worthy.
Yeah, there was a Kickstarter for this a couple years ago, so it's cool to see that they've got that suit out on display now.
And what a great piece of history there. Second Link Space, which is a private Chinese company, they did a second launch and landing test where they were able to launch a rocket several meters in the air. I don't know how much. And then were able to land it right back down on the surface. And there were, 30 mile per hour winds and things like this. So it was not an insignificant feat. It sounds like they're really accelerating towards being able to do something similar to what SpaceX does in recovering their boosters. Intelsat 29E was declared a total loss after 3 years. It's a geosynchronous satellite, which those are usually designed to last 15 to 20 years. But there was, I think, a leak in the propulsion system, and so it is. It's up there. It is now just one big piece of space debris. To the point that you were talking about earlier there, John. So this was a really cool one. Mary Golda Ross of Lockheed Martin was honored by the United States Mint by being put on a coin. She's the first engineer honored on a coin, male or female. And she is a female at that, and a Cherokee, so a Native American or American Indian, as they were saying it in the press release. She helped develop the Athena and Gemini. I'm sorry, she helped the Agena during the Gemini and Apollo missions. You can tell I'm reading and I'm doing a horrible job. I don't know why y'all hired me. So, Kudos to her. Congratulations to her. That's a it's if you take a look at it, it's a really awesome looking coin. And so that's a great piece of space memorabilia. And then also if you collect coins, that might be a great one to pick up. Northrop Grumman, their Antares rocket launched Cygnus spacecraft to the ISS successfully on April 17th. They launched out of NASA Wallops on mission NG-11. I watched that launch. It seemed to go off without a hitch, and it was significant because it was the last in a series of contracts they have before they start their new contracts, and it also they were able to show that they can load cargo onto the rocket within 24 hours of the rocket launch, which is not a capability they had before. And that is significant because you have perishables like food and that kind of thing on there, and that just makes them a better better able to service their clients, including NASA and the International Space Station. So kudos to them. Congratulations to them. Earth Day was April 22nd. Yay, Earth! Inspired by that wonderful picture and video that the astronauts on Apollo, it was 8, right? Apollo 8.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
As they went around the moon, they saw the moon rise and they took that shot. And ever since then, we've realized, you know what, we're not all these countries with all these little lines, squiggly lines on the Earth. The Earth is just one place, and it's all our home. We are all, one thing. And so it's important to remember that and to protect Earth and to take care of her. Spaceship Earth is the only place we live. So, NASA is testing anti-regolith technology on the ISS for a possible use on future lunar missions. So, regolith is basically they don't have dirt on the moon. They don't have soil. Soil requires biology, and dirt is something different as well. Regolith is basically a bunch of small little razor-like particles that have been the result of the surface being pummeled by all kinds of impactors over the eons. And it's very coarse. It tears up your lungs if you breathe it in. It's actually not an insignificant problem for a lunar base or lunar missions. And so NASA is now testing this anti-regolith technology to basically, when you're decontaminating a spacesuit, it can help propel and get rid of the regolith in a way that makes it cleaner. So that is yet another example of them preparing for Mars 2024. Oh, I'm sorry, Moon 2024 landing.
Yeah, this is a huge problem. I mean, when you have astronauts going on EVAs outside the base and coming back in on the moon or Mars, they're going to be tracking in this dust, the regolith particles, and that could be very bad for not only the health of the crew, but just getting everything dirty, getting all the instruments dirty, and the equipment malfunctioning as a result. So whatever they can do to,
I mean,
remove some of that from the
it's
spacesuit.
sharp and difficult enough to deal with. It can actually damage things. It's not simply that I got some smudges on my table here. It's can be very problematic.
Yes.
All right. Mars Analog has been started in China. So the Mars Society has the MDRS, the Mars Desert Research Station. The Mars Society Australia and the Australian Space Agency, as Jonathan mentioned earlier in the podcast, does have another analog station that they're working towards. But probably the most well-funded analog station that I'm aware of is the Chinese analog station, and it is now operational, and it looks pretty.
Yeah, it's really impressive. I've seen the pictures of it inside and out, and they spent a lot of money on that base, a lot more than the Mars Society has been able to spend on ours. But
So if you want to help us catch up, you can always
yes,
donate, and we will definitely name things after you, just like we did for Elon Musk.
good point. But no, this is a really exciting development in China. They're serious about sending humans to Mars someday, and this is evidence of that. They're putting their
Absolutely,
money where their mouth is.
I agreed. They're definitely on a roadmap, and they're not being shy about it. Okay, so moving on to it's a great segue, in fact, and maybe not accidentally. James, you just did an op-ed article on LinkedIn,
Hmm.
and in it you were talking about the fact that you do believe there is a space race going on, or actually several space races going on. The evidence is all around us, and you think it's a good thing, and it's not necessarily the same kind of race that was back in the Cold War, and it's not as hostile necessarily, but it is going on. And Jonathan, my understanding is your point of view is slightly different. That this whole jingoistic idea of a space race is not necessarily A, beneficial, and B, you don't think that it's as there as James would have it. So I wanted to get that discussion going and see what we figured out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I wrote this article. I had have a lot of conversations with Jonathan and others on social media over the last year or two about, are we in a space race? Are we in a race to go to Mars, to go back to the moon? And my contention, and one of the reasons why I wrote this article, is I wanted to call out, what are we racing towards? To be in a race, you have to have a goal, and what are the goals that we're all trying to accomplish within the whole space ecosystem? All the countries of the world, all the companies and organizations, SpaceX, NASA, Roscosmos, China, all of these entities that are working on space projects. What are we racing
JAXA.
towards? Yeah, JAXA as well. So I enumerated out in my article specific goals for the moon, for Mars, and also for the outer planets. And so, for example, we need to return humans back to the moon for the first time since 1972. We need to send the first woman to the moon. We need to send large cargo shipments to the moon. Something that NASA is actively working on, has awarded some RFP, or has done some RFPs already, and has selected some companies to be able to do that. And so those may actually happen very soon, in the next 12 months.
Yeah.
So a lot of different goals. And my contention is, when you look at what is the space race of the 2020s, and that's the name of my article, there are multiple space races, and the evidence for people working on them is all around us if you know where to look. So we mentioned the China Mars analog. That's evidence of China wanting to send the first human beings to Mars, as are many of us in the US, including those in the Mars Society, working on that same goal. So it is a space race. It's not a hostile Cold War space race where we're trying to beat the Russians because we want to show our supremacy, and it's going to also show it in other, if we can get to the moon before the Russians, we're going to also show our technical capacity and avoid nuclear war.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like that, but it is something where I want Americans to get back to the moon before anyone else. And I think that will be a prestigious thing for our country, but it will also trickle down into other areas and help our country with other things. And so if China goes to the moon before us, or goes to Mars before us, I'll be sad a little bit. I'll still be happy that they landed humans, but because it's something I want to see no matter who it is. But I will be a little sad that it wasn't the Americans. So, John, what are your thoughts on all this?
Well, certainly, I think it's good to outline an agenda for the next few decades. and it helps us think about what can be done, what should be done, what might be done. I just don't see what is happening, a race. I simply see people pursuing, organizations, countries pursuing their own agendas according to their capabilities and according to their national interests. So, for example, I don't see any evidence. I mean, China works on a 5-year space program. They keep their schedule pretty closely on that. And were the US to land on the moon by 2024 again, or return to the moon by that, I don't see them advancing at all. So that's fine. We'll still work on our own program with the funding that we have, the resources they have, and get to the moon by 2030 in terms of people. Same with India. I mean, they're talking about putting people into space in the next few years. I mean, it's not really a race, because no one's in a great hurry. It's just as countries develop, as economies develop, as our knowledge develops, capability develops, people do these things. I think, and it's the same as, in a sense, there's no winner take all prize. If the more people who are exploring space, the more we'll learn about it. The more people putting up commercial satellites for Earth observation, the more different products we have available for us to use, and so the more communication satellites go up, the more different means of communications that we have, be they geostationary or whether they be in polar orbit or some other type of configuration. So I just see development. I don't necessarily see a competitive race, simply because there's no winner take all goal.
So your contention then is that because even if China gets to the South Pole of the moon first with humans, that doesn't mean that NASA can't also send people to the same area, and that regardless of who goes there, that we'll all benefit from that. That's your contention.
Yeah, that's right. We look at Antarctica. I mean, there are, in many parts of Antarctica, multiple stations of different countries within quite close distance of each other. For example, Lasman Hills has stations from China, India, Romania, and Russia, all within a few kilometers of each other. And the same may well be the case on the moon. But things could get crowded in places like the South Pole or the poles, where there may only be particular areas that are suitable. But that's something that can be worked out. It's not a case of, well, we're here and no one else can go. And the same with Mars. I mean, Mars has got the surface area of Earth. It's not as if people need to compete for particular locations that are better than anybody else.
I disagree. I do think it is very important who is first at a large milestone.
Why?
Because of prestige, look at when the original space race was to put a satellite up in orbit. And, the Americans made an innocent comment at a conference, an international geophysical conference, that we were going to try to put a satellite up. And the Russians heard that and went back and worked on it super fast and got Sputnik up before the Americans. And that was a humongous shockwave in the United States in 1957, that Russia had an orbital satellite before us.
Do you think we would have landed on the moon had that not had Sputnik not gone up?
It was. I don't. Also, the fact that they got the first man in space before us was a huge issue to Americans. Yes, Alan Shepard was scheduled to go up before him. They had an issue with the Mercury rocket, and so they did an additional test flight, and that pushed out his flight about 2 weeks, which is just enough for Yuri Gagarin to be first, and not only first with going to space, but with an orbital mission, which was a capability that we didn't match until John Glenn's flight a couple years later.
Yeah.
So for Americans, this does hit home a lot. We want to be first. We want to show the world the way, our leadership in the space arena, and to continue that. And so, the picture you painted, Jonathan, of if China lands on the South Pole first, that's just fine. I don't think most Americans would feel that way. I think we would be pretty disappointed, especially with our recent goal announcement of going back to the moon and by 2024. It's when you say that they're not working on it, that makes me feel good, but I also want to see us there first.
Well,
first of all, the Cold War is long over. The Cold War is long over, and it was a very unique period of time. One would hope that some of the idiocies of that period don't get repeated. The Russians have been working for a long time. It was always their plan to put up a satellite in the IGY, and they announced that they're going to do it right at the start, actually, of the IGY in 1957. So it wasn't a competitive thing. And Sputnik, the first satellite was actually going to be what became Sputnik 3, but it was which is a very ambitious satellite. And in the end, they decided not to risk that on the first launch, but to do something much smaller and much simpler, which became Sputnik 1. So I think even then, most of the idea of it being a space race was conjured up by politicians and the media. And the reality is that most of our achievements in space have not been due to space race mentality. I mean, we're exploring the solar system not through space race mentality. Communication satellites aren't due to space race. Weather satellites or the CubeSats aren't a space race. And I think we need to look beyond the sort of the media cliches of the 60s and 50s even as we move out, because that won't sustain it. Obviously, the idea of space spectaculars, which Apollo was, it got us to the moon, but then it stopped, and people come with all sorts of grumpy ideas of why it stopped, but it stopped because it achieved its goal. Got a man on the moon before the decade was out and returned them safely to the Earth, and the fact we got another 5 moon landings after that was really a bonus. I mean, the same with the Soviet Union. They wanted space spectaculars that looked good, but it wasn't until they really knuckled down and focused on Earth orbital operations that they really started making substantial achievements rather than just flashes in the pan. And
well, so my question then is, I'm trying to stay somewhat neutral here, but I'll be honest with you. I do have some bias here. I'm American, right? And I like America. And
my commiserations.
Thank you.
You are from Texas, Christopher. So there's Texas is the best country in the world.
It's the best country in the world, Texas, and I like America too. But no. The point of it, though, that what I was going to say is, I think that there might be some naivete, not to try and gang up on you too much, Jonathan, in that I think if China goes to the South Pole first and starts mining the resources on the South Pole, they're going to lay claim. And if America or anybody else tries to go there and starts doing that, China is going to start getting territorial. I mean, look at what they're doing in the South China Sea. And then you got, I think it's actually more analogous to, the 1700s when you had all of these European countries sending ships over to the Americas, and whoever got to a location first, that became their territory. Mm-hmm. And the reason why I'm speaking English now is because of, the English going to certain sections of North America. And the reason why Mexico speaks Spanish and Brazil speaks Portuguese is because those countries went to those areas first. Mm-hmm. And that doesn't guarantee, it's like, Texas was actually part of Mexico for a long time. So there's no reason why I shouldn't necessarily be speaking Spanish, and I can speak a little bit. But the point of it is, I think that there is a little bit more competition there, and I think there's a little bit more to be won in getting there first than you're making out to be. I mean, am I wrong there? Do you think I'm being overzealous in that point of view?
I would say several things there. First of all, it's not the 16th century anymore. I mean, the way nations work, way organization work, has changed. I mean, we don't.
Oh, that's fair enough.
We don't have letters of marque anymore, where people can legally go and pirate other people's ships. We don't have slavery anymore. I mean, as systems of government, we don't have divine right of kings.
I would say legal slavery. There's still a lot of it. Unfortunately.
Well, that's shifting the goalposts. You can no longer go and legally buy shares in the slave-owning companies.
Right.
I mean, we still have unjust working conditions. We still have things like indentured labor and so on, but they're very different. I mean, people were proud of owning human beings. We don't, by and large, own human beings anymore. I mean, we have people working for us, sometimes unfairly, unjustly, may not be well treated, but slavery is a dead question. We don't have legal piracy anymore, and many of you.
Yeah.
So the world works differently. We've always got to be careful of propaganda, okay? And there's a lot of propaganda about the South China Sea. The reality is the South China Sea has been China's backyard for the last 3,000 years, and they haven't threatened anyone. They haven't expanded their territory. They've just essentially asserted their control over stuff that has been theirs for a long time.
They have expanded their territory, though. They've made some artificial islands down there and put military bases on them.
But remember, Chinese fishermen have been visiting those reefs for thousands of years, some of these reefs actually do have islands on them, in which people have fallen up on and have temporary camps on. So, I'm quite actually sympathetic to their position. I mean, the South China Sea is like the Gulf of Mexico, just off Texas.
Yeah.
And if China or Russia started saying, well, whatever you're doing there, your oil rigs or whatever, are a threat to world peace, then people in the US would get rather twitchy about that. So I think we have to be cynical of political rhetoric in that regard. On the moon, there's a lot that needs to be done before we can start mining ice on the moon. And we have to, we're not going to just land there and suddenly set up a huge propellant factory. I mean, we've actually got to do a lot of research into mining ice, find out if there's even enough to be worthwhile. I mean, one nasty little thing about lunar polar ice deposits, they're almost certainly full of mercury. For exactly the same reason. It gets sweated out of the rocks with the high temperatures on the lunar surface of the equator, and it migrates to the poles. It gets trapped collects in the cold traps. And I
love having a geologist. I love it. Thank you.
Oh, you like it when I talk rocks? Yeah, so do I. So a lot goes on, and the other thing too is the amount of material that you need to process to support a lunar outpost is actually surprisingly small. I haven't done the numbers for lunar outposts, I confess, but I have done it for Mars. And your average 6-person lunar Martian outpost and propellant to get people back to orbit or even to Earth, you could just about collect by someone going out with a pick and shovel every day and working for a couple of hours. And it's only a few hundred kilograms a day that you need to collect to supply that. So potential water resources on the moon, and they are potential, they're not actual resources, extend over not just in the dark areas, which people forget, but actually extend over some of the lighted areas as well. So let's just see what happens. And of course, there are agreements in terms of what people can and can't claim in terms of territory. And it'll be very much, at the moment, the idea is, and there are lunar mining conferences I've been to, is that, as with the Antarctic, you have a station there from Peru or any other country, and that's their territory. And there's a sort of a buffer zone that's recognised around it. So if you want to go and work there, well, that's fine if there's an interesting feature, but you talk to them first because it's their backyard. So
courtesy.
Courtesy, and also the safety. I mean, you don't want to do something that impinges on them, and they might be doing something that would be hazardous to you if you go there, like blasting or so on, and particularly on the moon. And people talk very glibly about, we don't need, don't have to worry about environmental regulations on the moon, but we do. Some of the lunar oxygen proposals involve using hydrogen fluoride, which is a very nasty substance to extract it out of the rocks. And you can just imagine someone's oxygen plant dumping hydrogen fluoride vapors into the lunar atmosphere, such as it is. And then the telescope 20 kilometers away gets rather upset because their optics are being chewed up by these tenuous vapors. So, people bag out the Outer Space Treaty, but a comment that was made at the last lunar mining conference I went to, the interesting thing is there's been not one, every conflict of interest in space has always been resolved out of court, according to the principles of the Outer Space Treaty. So no one said, we're going to sue you. They say, well, look, we're not happy about this. And things like positions for geostationary satellites, which are quite competitive because they're starting to fill up. And there are particular slots over the US, over Europe, over Southeast Asia, which are jam-packed. And essentially all of these disputes have been resolved peacefully according to the principles from countries that don't necessarily get on very well, India and China, India and Pakistan, but they see it in their interest to do so. So you can't rule out conflict, but I don't think we should assume. We should assume it, and of course, if we assume it, then we can end up creating it.
It still is a risk, though. I mean, NASA was very deliberate when they sent the Apollo 11 mission to be the first on the moon, that the civilian commander, Neil Armstrong, was a civilian, not a military person. He was first. We had the plaque that said, "We came in peace for all mankind." The Outer Space Treaty talks about how no country can own things in space, and they have to share it with everyone. Space is the kind of owned by everybody or nobody.
International waters, so to speak.
Yeah, international waters. So there is a risk that if China or Russia or any country goes to the South Pole of the moon and starts using the lunar ice, that they're going to claim property rights of the area they're in.
Well, and I would say particularly if we say, oh well, China did it, so we don't have to do it now. Even if they're first, but we say, okay, well that means that we're not going to do our program. I think it's more likely that they would become more bold and do something like that.
Look, I think we need to remember the difference in hazard and risk. I think these are hazards. I think the reality is the risk is extremely small because, again, in their conduct of space activities, both China and Russia have been, with the exception of anti-satellite tests, of which the US is also guilty, and India. They've been extremely responsible. So they have not claimed territory. They've not shown any indication of claiming territory. There's no advantage for them to do so. So I think we can imagine all sorts of scenarios that would make a nice movie or a nice book. But I mean, the reality is, I don't think there's much chance of that happening. Because all of remember, the Russian space program is actually very small. The Russian economy is about the same size as Germany. I mean, the US spends more on space than the rest of the world put together, and nobody's going to make any claims that no one else is going to recognize, and no one's going to get involved in any kind of one-upmanship, which they're going to lose for foreseeable future. So, it's
So
just
James, I think Jonathan is making some pretty valid points. That, like, look, cooperation has really been the standard in
Hmm.
space, particularly over the last 20, 25 years. And while it's conceivable that something like that might happen, he's not saying, well, there's no possibility, but the idea that that's going to happen is low. That the possibility is low, and it's much more likely that, as we've done with the International Space Station in on Antarctica and elsewhere, that the nations are going to work together.
Hmm.
If not for no other reason than the fact that they still have to go back and play at the same tables, and
mm.
you know
And I think you mentioned international waters before, and I think Antarctica is also a case that countries have an obligation to help each other out if they're in distress in international waters.
yeah
In the Antarctic, even at the height of the Cold War, countries from antagonistic sides were collaborating in the Antarctic, and people on the ground or on the ice maintain good relations with each other. Come over and have a beer, come over and have some vodka.
yeah
And in emergency, I think there was a case in the '60s where a British doctor broke his back in an accident in a crevasse, and he was evacuated by Russian aircraft to an American base where they had the medical facilities to treat him. So there is precedent that even if things are perhaps dicey on Earth, that people on the ground in space will cooperate under the appropriate circumstances. I mean, during the Falklands War in 1982, British and Argentine stations, which were within a few hundred meters of each other on the Antarctic Peninsula, continued to maintain good relations, even though their countries were at war. So, we're funny creatures, humans.
oh, that I can agree with.
Well, both a good thing in both good and bad ways. Funny, peculiar, and funny, good.
I'm all for cooperation and international missions in space, and I do think when the first humans go to Mars, it will likely be an international mission where several countries are represented just because of the scale of that mission. I do, though, think there is a role for competition. I do think for some it does galvanize more funding and more public interest to be in what's perceived as a space race with another country. And so why don't we just compromise and say it's going to be co-opetition?
Yeah, that's a good way to put
back
it.
to that word.
I wonder though if people do anymore. I have been very interested in the lack of US response to the Chinese lunar rovers,
Hmm.
which are amazing achievements now on the far side. Because the US had crewed rovers there 60 years, 50 years ago.
Well,
Um,
I don't
and
think a 2024 moonshot versus 2028, which was the plan, is not
yeah,
a non-response. I think that's a pretty
yeah,
There's also several cargo flights being planned right now.
yeah,
Conceivably, one of those could put a rover on the far side in response
yeah,
to China. So I would say stay tuned. I wouldn't say that
yeah.
there's no activity there on the U.S. side to
and
Well,
respond to China.
I
well,
told you all both
hopefully
about
US
that
will
article
come
that
to
I read
the
this morning about from
yeah,
ESA. I'll give you a chance to respond. I'm sorry, John. But
yeah.
the European Space Agency, the Director General was speaking about how they have to kind of get a fire lit under themselves because of America's 2024 moonshot and China's moon landing, and so they got their lunar missions planned, and it's not a thing where it's like we got to do it or else we're going to lose something specific. But actually, the thing that he's worried about losing is member states because he's having to deal with a lot of different constituencies from different countries and all that. But
Mm.
I think there is competition there, and I think it would be hard. Like even maybe one can argue should there be or not. And I think cooperation is definitely a way to go in an ideal world. But I also think that, like you said, humans are peculiar, And one of the things about humans is, at least a good subset of the population is very competitive.
Yeah.
And they do care about those kinds of things.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the reality is, through most of the Apollo program, the majority of the people in the US didn't care and didn't think it was worth doing. I think also we shouldn't confuse the recognition that people need to maintain their capabilities as signs of a space race or any a race. It's just that, we need to be part. This is where the world's at. We need to be part of it. A country builds a new particle accelerator. It's not the sign of, oh dear, there's a particle accelerator gap. It's a sign that, if we want to build, if you want to be part of the frontiers of physics, we need to have this new facility.
Well, it's funny you mentioned that. I drove through Waxahachie 3 or 4 days ago. Waxahachie would have been the location of a CERN Large Hadron Collider type particle accelerator, but here in Texas, and it was defunded by Congress, and all that history. I don't want to go too much into it, but I can tell you that the effect on my home state, let alone my home country, is great. I mean, all of the people that have gone over to Switzerland to work on that and are living there, they could have been coming from our universities and living in our place and enriching where I live. And on the one hand, that's a very selfish and self-centered and, as you were saying the other day, jingoistic kind of point of view. There's part of me that can't help but say, man, what could have been? And it bothers me, and I'm more into to some people, but it also bothers people like my wife, who doesn't really care a hoot about space. Her focus is in things like medical and medicine and that kind of thing.
I think that's a different I think that's a different kind of activity. I think that's that is maintaining national or regional, as the case may be, capability in the interests of your own population. And it doesn't mean to say, it's a race of particle accelerators or radio telescopes or whatever. But this is important for us to have this capability to develop this. I mean, Europe would have gone ahead with their particle accelerator, regardless of whether the superconducting super collider.
Yeah, I couldn't tell you offhand.
Whether that had been built. And it's unfortunate for Texas that it didn't. I mean, but particle physics is an international community, and people move around. Yeah. So it'd be very nice to have seen it being built, but. And I thought,
it was just to as a counterpoint. So, all right, guys. So, for the viewers out there, I want y'all to sound off on this. What is your position? Is there a space race? Should there be a space race? Is there not? Is it more something else that is more benign? And on Twitter, use hashtag MarsTalk to whenever you're sounding off on this. Or you can go on our website. You can go on our Discord server and chat with us there as well. So let us know, what do you think about whether or not there is a space race or not. Guys, thank you for the lively discussion. Hopefully, Jonathan, you don't feel too ganged up on. And I really appreciate the discussion. I think it was actually enlightening. I learned a couple things from you, John, and I didn't learn anything from you, James. I'm sorry.
Co-opetition. You learned that word.
Well, that was last week. That was last episode. So I had
it's a nice idea, but a horrible word. To see if you come up with something that's I don't know. That's horrible.
Be less horrible, James, please.
Yeah, something that. Yeah.
Hashtag there is a space race.
A politician would come up with.
All right.
Incentivization. Yeah.
That's funny. All right, so on to organizational news. So This is going to be very Dr. Zubrin centric, just because he's doing a lot right now. So
Really?
Dr. Zubrin. Oh, yeah. So Dr. Zubrin made comments in response to a space news article by Jeff Frost showing that a 2033 human Mars mission is not feasible according to an independent report. Dr. Zubrin used this opportunity to reiterate the follies of NASA's current exploration plan and pointed to the Mars Direct plan as a viable, preferable alternative. The full article can be found on the Mars Society's website at www.marssociety.org. Jonathan, did you have something to say about this?
Yeah, I mean, look, I like Mars Direct. I mean, it's what got me involved in doing Mars stuff. But the idea is 30 years old. It hasn't known now. I really hasn't got traction up to now. I really don't think it's going to get traction in the future. Its great value was it got people thinking about particular approaches to Mars missions, and it's probably one of the most influential studies of a Mars mission to date. You know,
There's
I
still
think we have to be.
there's still elements though
Sorry,
of the Mars Direct plan. I think that will ultimately be used no matter what
yeah,
architecture is. ISRU
absolutely.
for one, making the methane rocket fuel on Mars to go back. Excuse me. And then also just the idea of a lift and throw from Earth to Mars instead of assembling a spaceship in Earth orbit, I think also is something. If you look at SpaceX's BFR design, the Starship, that would be a lift and throw mission to Mars. So there are elements of Mars Direct that are still super innovative that I think will ultimately be used in whatever plan is ultimately.
Yes, I mean the 5 NASA DRMs are all heavily were all based on Mars semi-direct, so it has had a huge influence. As said, I mean the concept of ISRU, which wasn't original to Mars Direct, but certainly it pushed it forward. I think the idea that we go to Mars for long periods of time, again not original with it, but it was actually the best way to do it, I think is another important thing. Another aspect of it, just pointing out that when you go to Mars, the safest place is on the surface. I mean, there are a lot of ideas that you spend most of your time in orbit and only occasionally do a short sortie to the surface. And I think the fact that if you want to go to Mars, it's far better to do everything on the surface rather than from orbit. I think that's a very important part of it. Also showing how much could be achieved once you make those decisions of being focused on the surface, and therefore 18 months of a stretch, I think was very valuable. But you can achieve those by other ways. And in the end, my own thing, I'm not Robert, so I can't speak for him. But to me, in the end, it's important we get to Mars and we do good stuff when we're there. If it's not exactly how I do it, that's not the main thing. I mean, I have my own Mars
It's less
mission
about the
architecture.
how and more about the fact that it happens.
Exactly. And sometimes things that are technically inefficient may be actually more politically astute and achievable.
Well, so the argument that Dr. Zubrin was making specifically in response to this article, though, to just as a counterpoint to you as a devil's advocate, is that the plan that NASA has is so infeasible that you wouldn't just not get there by 2033. You'll never get there because it's too expensive. It's too massive, and it's too big of a juggernaut that it's gone too far. The pendulum has swung too far in the other direction. That sure. I think Dr. Zubrin would be very happy to see a mission that actually has landed on Mars, even if it wasn't exactly the one he came up with, but that the architecture that they are currently pursuing is one that won't get us to that point. It just won't happen.
Yeah, he may be right, but I think we also have to remember that a lot of people, a lot of organizations are supporting that approach. I mean, the National Academy of Sciences is supporting that approach. The Planetary Society has supported that approach, and that's the largest space lobby group in the US, in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, a number of companies have suggested, perhaps have supported it. Perhaps they're feathering their own nests. But to me, the main attraction of that approach is, well, yes, it's more expensive in the long run. Yes, it's longer, but it breaks up the Mars mission into politically feasible bites. Just like on a much smaller scale, sample return from Mars, which is probably a good precursor to sending people to Mars, has always been too hard, and it's been the top priority for 30 years, 40 years after the initial Viking missions of a Mars mission, and we've never done it, simply because it was too big, too complicated, too expensive. But with the 2020 mission, we came up with the idea, well, let's just collect the samples. And that'll be one mission, and then we'll worry about getting them back. So this big mission suddenly breaks down into smaller, more politically and fiscally achievable chunks, even if the final cost might be greater. And I think the idea with the that's been proposed by the Academy of Sciences, by NASA, by the Planetary Society, is a bit like that. Yes, it's not how I would do it. I'd do something like Mars semi-direct. But it may be more achievable. But and then we have the issue. I mean, do we oppose the do we propose the best and at the expense of actually doing anything at all? So
yeah.
I'm a spectator here. I don't understand. I mean, we're pleased if we can put a CubeSat in space, let alone do this sort of stuff. I mean, if we get the right analyzer, well, I'll be happy. But yeah, I think sometimes we work with that. I mean, lots of people didn't like Lunar Orbit Rendezvous too.
Well, we'll talk about that now. Great segue. So, Dr. Zubrin also, the day before that last article, wrote an op-ed published on spacenews.com entitled Lunar Gateway or Moon Direct. While it might not be difficult to guess which Dr. Zubrin advocated for, particularly in light of our conversation we just had, he did make a very compelling case as to why the architecture of NASA's plan is, as my wife would put it, less than optimal, and then laid out the Moon Direct plan. Now, I'm not going to go into super high detail on what the Moon Direct plan is, because I actually think we will do that in the next episode. Episode 3 will lay out the Moon Direct plan in high detail. But in the meantime, you can go to that article on spacenews.com, read it for yourself, and he does Dr. Zubrin does a fantastic job of laying it out. Mm-hmm. But the very basics of it are this. We send ISRU, which is in situ resource utilization. In other words, we take the stuff that is on the moon and use it for air, water, rocket fuel, that sort of thing. Robotics, and we habitation modules that are uncrewed at the moment. And we put those on the surface to pave a way for a human crew to eventually land. By the time we send the human crew down there, the resources will be there. The rocket fuel will be ready for us to just, all you have to do is pump it into the rocket and go. And so it's literally low risk because we all already know that everything that we need is there. It will have worked or it won't have worked before we start sending the humans. It is also going to be directly from Earth to maximize delta V efficiency. Think gas mileage, essentially. It's the amount of ability a spacecraft has to change its velocity, its direction and speed. You also, to give Moon Direct plan its full attention, again, we'll talk about it in high detail next time. And so if we want to do some quick comments, but almost lightning around this one, but he did write that article. I wanted to make sure I mentioned it to people so that they could go out and read it. It's very much along the same lines as Mars Direct. It's just tailored towards the moon.
And he makes some great points that the Lunar Gateway, which is NASA's plan to put a space station around the moon, kind of a reusable command module that would be used for lunar landings, is not necessarily
very much I'm sorry, I didn't mean to just run right over you and interrupt you, but Bridenstine has been very consistent in saying that it was a very necessary thing for 2024.
Yeah, it was the plan already when he came into the position he's in, and he's advocating for it still. But Zubrin makes a good point that it is not required. If you want to send people to the surface of the moon, you should send them to the surface of the moon and not build a space station first.
Right. And the reason for that is because you have to spend more fuel, you have to have a lot more mass. It's just a lot less efficient from an engineering perspective, if none other, and a cost perspective.
Now, the pro argument for the Lunar Gateway would be that it would create a more sustainable set of moon landings because you already have that asset there and you can use it to reach all the different parts of the moon. It'll be in an orbit that can be changed easily so that you can reach the poles or the equatorial regions with landers from launching from the gateway. It's the fact that it's reusable would mean that you have an architecture there that's sustainable long term, and that's also what NASA is trying to go for with the lunar return they're working on.
Fair enough.
Hmm.
All right. So
the other argument is it's called a gateway because it can also support asteroid missions and Mars missions as well. So it's not a lunar specific facility. This again is the idea that what is less efficient in the short term actually builds capability longer term, and in the end it becomes 6 of one and a half a dozen of the other. I mean, let's just do something. rather than, yeah.
The architecture we were.
I don't care what you do, just do something. Come on, man.
The architecture we were talking about before for the Mars mission that was for 2033 would have made use of the Lunar Gateway, and you'd build a deep space habitat, deep space transport, I think they call it, that would launch from the Gateway. So it's kind of it's a building block piece of a Mars mission too. So
yeah. I think when we have Dr. Zubrin on, he is going to just he's going to have a fun time talking about that.
I think part of the reason also that's driven that decision has been the big problem with the US is that every time there's a change of president, there's a different vision. And the advantage of doing something like the Gateway, it fits all three visions that have come and gone over the decades: the moon, Mars, or asteroids. And the thing is, once that's there. And even if it's that's achievable within one presidential cycle, and even if the long-term goal changes, it's already there. Rather than having to reinvent everything from scratch.
So it might be engineering and cost-wise the wrong way to go, but from a political perspective, your argument is it's actually smarter. It's got to make it more likely that things will actually happen from a political standpoint. Yeah,
I mean, someone once said politics is the art of the possible, and maybe this is it.
Mm-hmm. I have other ideas about what some politics are, but
look,
no, I've heard that quote. I'm not trying to.
Yeah.
Okay, so Mars Society's 22nd annual convention will be convened October 17th through 20th at the University of Southern California in Los Angeles. James mentioned this earlier, talking about having an analog symposium as well at the same time in the same location. The theme for 2019 is the Space Launch Revolution, opening the way to Mars. Make plans to come and check it out. We will definitely link to it. You can go to marssociety.org or marstalk.org to find out more information. And then finally, Dr. Zubrin, who, like I said, was a busy man this last 2 weeks, he is releasing a book, The Case for Space, How the Revolution in Spaceflight Opens Up a Future of Limitless Possibility. And I just so happen, bear with me, guys.
There it is.
I'm going to show off one of my pride and joys here. I went and met Dr. Zubrin, what was it, like 5, maybe 6 weeks ago. And I was able to get an advanced copy. So this is not just a copy of the book, but it is from before they had finalized the book for publishing. So if you look in there, there's a bunch of zeros next to all the things
Oh
because it
yeah,
hadn't been figured out yet. And of course, it is
of
signed
course.
by Dr. Zubrin.
Nice.
And so this book, though, I'm sure he'll be selling it at that symposium and at the conference in October. But it goes on sale May 14th, I think. Is that what I said?
Yes.
And so I'll be looking. It'll be on Amazon and all the bookstores, all that kind of thing. So be looking for that. It's going to be a great read. It's a I haven't read through all of it, but what I've read so far has been very good. So shameless plug there for Dr. Zubrin's book.
He'll also be going to Italy the week before it comes out and doing 5 talks across Italy, and he'll be selling his book
You
at
jumped
those
the
as
gun on
well.
me. I was going to talk about that later, man. You're killing me.
Sorry.
No, you're fine. You're fine. No, yeah. So he's obviously going to be in the public eye a lot more, promoting the book and talking about what is in the book and that kind of thing. So, Italy is the most. It's going to be happening. I got to scroll down here. May 6th through 10th. He'll be in the Polytechnic of Turin, then Milan, Bologna.
Bologna, yeah.
It sounds wrong for me because we get the food.
That's
Bologna,
what it's named
Rome,
after.
and then Naples. Yes. Okay, so anyway, we'll go through that in a little bit more detail in a second here. But before we get to that, we want to move on to our chapter highlight for the week. Obviously, since we have the president of Mars Society Australia, we figured that we're going to talk about China. No, I'm just kidding. We're going to talk about Australia and all the wonderful things that are going on there. So, Jonathan, if you could illuminate us, what's going on in Australia?
Well, why do Mars research in Australia? Well, there are many reasons. First of all, like Mars, the landscape is old, flat, and red.
I've seen a place or two like that around here too.
That's right. The difference is that we have places where you can do traverses for hundreds of kilometers and not cross state boundary or get shot at by grumpy locals. So
we don't have that around here. You get shot at a lot. No.
Yeah, it's one of the few places in the world where you can actually do that. There are others and still speak English of a sort. So Australia has many geological and biological analogues for people who want to do that. So it's a good place to come to study geological processes, astrobiological processes. It's a good place to test things like operational research, which is things like MDRS is primarily there for. And particularly, as I said, the long duration, long range traverses. So we in Mars Society Australia, which have been around for nearly 20 years now, have been pushing Australia as a place to do that. For Northern Hemisphere people too, the advantage of Australia is your off-season is our on-season. When it's too hot in the Northern Hemisphere to go and work in the nearby desert, you can come to Australia where it's nice and cool and you can work. And vice versa, when it's too hot for us, we can trot off to the Northern Hemisphere and work up there. So there's many advantages coming to Australia, and this is why we've been working on, we've done a variety of expeditions. We've done at a place called Arkaroola, which we selected in 2001 as our prime Mars analog research location. This is an area of very complex geology, very complex geomorphology. It's extensively used by many universities for field trips. There's an eco-tourist lodge there. They own the property and they're very supportive of science education and outreach. They have their own observatories. They host the various university groups that go through there. So they're very cooperative in what we do, very supportive with what we do. So it's a place with a good secure tenure. Because it's a privately owned land or leased land, again, there's less bureaucracy to jump through to actually get things done. And because they're committed to what we are doing, it's not like saying working on someone else's property where an owner is likely to change and so, no, we don't want all you weird people dressing in spacesuits coming up here. So we've got a good location, it's good logistically. It's about 8 hours drive from the city, but there are all-weather airstrips there to medevac people. Australia has a very good air evacuation system for emergencies, so there's a high safety aspects to working there. And we would like to build our own Mars analog research station. We've been trying to do that for 20 years. It would cost about $1.5 million Australian, about $1 million US to build. The design is quite different to MDRS. It's essentially a horizontal biconic. And in fact, I should have thought about this earlier, but I actually got a model of one here. It looks something like this.
Oh yeah, look at
so
that.
yeah, so imagine a space shuttle without wings. It's about the same size, or the front half of a 767 airliner, which is within a few centimeters the same diameter. Be 2 decks. It would actually, unlike MDRS, which is prefabricated and set up on site, this would actually be towed up. Imagine a prime mover sitting out under the front here, and it would be towed out to the desert as a unit built in the city, fitted out, tested, and then taken out and set up there. So we've got a detailed structural design for that, a detailed costing, and we just have to find the sponsors, and that's been our big challenge for the last 20 years. Now, why have we chosen this shape? Well,
it looks something like you'd throw into the atmosphere, right?
Well, that's right. First of all, this is actually a very good shape for a Mars lander. It's a much higher lift than the sort of thing that a tuna can, like with Mars Direct, which again is a good design. It'll be less stressful on the crew, allow more accurate landing. Any kind of Mars landing would involve complex aerodynamic maneuvers. People have seen the SpaceX videos of how they're going to land on Mars. That illustrates that it's not unique to landing a BFR on Mars. Anyone.
He likened it to like a skydiver more than like an airplane.
That's right. But it's a combination of lift and propulsion. So that's a very good shape for that. It's been used for quite a few Mars mission designs, but the main reason we chose it is it's a different configuration, and this configuration is actually probably better for living on Mars than an MDRS tuna can. I love MDRS. I've spent many months living there, and I'm very fond of it. But let's say you land in the wrong spot. It's a horrible shape to move around. This thing you could put on wheels and you could tow across the landscape. It would tow very well. MDRS is a bit like living in a lighthouse, which is great if you like round walls. This would be more like living in a railway sleeper car. There may be advantages, maybe disadvantages with that. But we wanted to have a facility where we could look at the architectural issues, look at the human factors issues with a different configuration. Plus, it looks different and looks cool. So we chose that.
Can't discount the cool factor, right?
Yeah, and as I said, we're looking for sponsors for that. In the meantime, we worked there doing other research. We've done field robotic expeditions there. We've done spacesuit trials there. We've done a wide range of field science. We've taken teachers and students there as well. So
what a cool field trip that would be! Oh,
it is, and all just 8 hours from a capital city, with an international airport. The other thing that we do is we worked with NASA to set up a Spaceward Bound program here in Australia, and that ended up going to Arcarola, going to the Pilbara, and then we created a parallel program in India. In 2016, we went over to India and did a trip to Ladakh, which is a far extreme northwest corner of India. If you went 20 kilometers one way, you're in Pakistan. If you went 20 kilometers the other way, you're in China. Right up into the Karakoram Mountains, doing field work at 5,500 meters, which is 18,000 feet. Oxygen molecules were a rare sight. And we had a wonderful time there. We had people from the US, Europe, India, of course, Australia, Central Asia, and we talked to kids in remote villages who had to travel days to come and see what we're doing, talking about space exploration. So it was a tremendous privilege. And as a result of that, and we've published a number of papers from that, but as a result of that, the Indian astrobiology program is now kicked off as a recognizable program in that country. So we've had an enormous impact there. And one of our directors, Siddharth Pandey, is now living in India and head of an astrobiology program at one of the universities. So he'd be a good guy to have on this program.
Well, definitely get us his information. We'll reach out.
Yeah.
Okay, so talk to me a little bit about how Mars Society Australia is connected with the government. Or is it a corporation? Is it a nonprofit entity? Is it just not? It's just a club. How does that work?
Okay, we're an incorporated company, non-profit company.
Okay.
So we have our own board of directors.
Okay.
Because we're a non-profit company, we submit an annual report to the federal government, the Charities Commission, a financial report, an activity report to make sure that we are eligible. We remain eligible for that status. We're also an approved research institute, which means that any external funds we get for our research projects are eligible for 125% tax deduction, which is
nice.
means that
so it's basically subsidized.
Well, people get, if they donate money to us, they would get quite a good tax return. And it's essentially the same deal that universities get. So even though we're only a very small organization with a tiny budget, we are legally and from a tax point of view, equivalent to a university, which was very much the effort of the previous president, which was David Cooper, who sadly passed away in 2012. But we've been able to use that. People who spend money on research projects, members, for example, are able to claim that money back from their tax. One of our people, Dr. Steve Hobbs, builds robots in his backyard, and has done a lot of research in how they might be used for small-scale Mars exploration, and he's been able to claim that back for about 5 years now. So that's how we function. Because we're an independent organization, we see ourselves as a sister organization, a sibling organization to the US Society, but we have similar goals, just expressed in a local context.
Do you have different chapters underneath the Australian organization, or is it just kind of one big organization that's nationwide?
It's not really, because we're quite small, it's not really effective to have local chapters, but we do have nodes, if you like. I mean, in different cities, Melbourne, here in Canberra, Adelaide, and at one time in Perth, there are people who run programs. So here in Canberra, we're involved with supporting the robotic program. Steve Hobbs in Melbourne, they work closely with other space groups like the Space Association of Australia in running programs. Our Adelaide people have also are the ones who have the regular meetings, and they get anything up to 50, 60 people every month to that. And that's probably a very strategic group, because the head of our space agencies, or our space agency, is now going to be set up and centered in Adelaide, which might become our Houston eventually. I mean, we're in a period of enormous flux as a nation in terms of our space activities, from a time where we were purely a consumer of space, purely a consumer of space services, to one where actually now universities are building test facilities, entrepreneurs are getting involved with the developing services, people are building CubeSats and so on. So there's an enormous sense of optimism that wasn't there 2 years ago. So I think this is a very, very, very encouraging thing, and a very good thing for the Mars Society as well.
We're going to go ahead and move on to organizational news. It's mostly just kind of giving you some updates on not organizational but chapter news, updates on what's going on in our chapters, and then we'll kind of close this thing out. So, as James mentioned earlier, jumping the gun on me, we have the Italian Mars Society. Dr. Robert Zubrin will be hosted by them, and he's going to be a special guest touring all across Italy. So on May 6th, he's going to be at the Polytechnic of Turin. May 7th, he'll be in Milan at FAST Association. On May 8th, he's going to be in Bologna at. I'm not gonna, honestly, I'm not even going to try and pronounce that. It's outside my range abilities. We got Rome, which is at the Italian Space Agency, and then in Naples at the Polytechnic of Naples. He will be the keynote speaker, and I'm sure he'll also be doing some work with his book, signing books and talking to people about that. So you also have Mars Society Colombia. They made a link with the government of Cundinamarca, and what they've done is they have now been able to reach children in 116 different regions in the area that those children didn't otherwise have any kind of access to any kind of science or technology programs. And so that's going to really open up that education for those kids, which is a fantastic thing. And we're really proud of Colombia for doing that. So the Mars Society Chile has begun a collaboration with the government's outreach office, Explora Valparaiso. The chapter did a lot of work to achieve this as an independent scientific consultants. Up to now, only researchers at the university level were able to work in this capacity, and so it was a really big coup for them to be able to get in there. Great work to Chile on achieving that.
I'm very excited about the Chilean chapter. As you know, there's the Atacama Desert in Chile is one of the best Mars analogs on the planet. And so it's great that we have a presence there. Also, my wife is Chilean, so I feel like that's part of the home team for me too.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know that. So yeah, so it's just one more location where one day we'll probably have a Mars analog, and they seem to be popping up all over the place, and so
Yep.
There's just it's just one more piece of evidence that the whole momentum is just really starting to move forward on all over the world. Mars Society Purdue, which is in Indiana, USA, and they are a very active university chapter within the Mars Society. They hosted a talk by Amy Ross, who heads NASA's Advanced Spacesuit Pressure Garment Development. She designed the gloves used by every spacewalking astronaut since 1998 and is currently working on the Z2 spacesuit, or Z2 for those in Australia and elsewhere, spacesuit to be used in upcoming Mars missions. The highlight of the event was the actual glove flown in space that the audience was able to, that she passed around and the audience was able to hold, touch, and really interact with. Everybody was really excited about that. So that was a very successful event, and congratulations to them on that. Mars Society Bing in New York, USA, just hosted the New York Space Symposium in 2019. This was sponsored by NASA's New York Space Grant Consortium and Watson School of Engineering. The theme for the conference was sustainability in space, dealing with orbital debris. There were several speakers. There were project competitions, lots of food, and giveaways. It went off really well. It was a big success, and they're planning on doing another event in 2020. So if you are in the New England area, you definitely want to check out Mars Society Bing and see what events they might have coming up, and plan on attending this event next year. Mars Society Scandinavia are partners in Mars VR and VR camera designers. because we have James on the program. James does or heads the Mars VR program here at the Mars Society. So I'm going to give it to him because he's been working with them pretty closely.
Yeah, I've been working with the organizer of Mars Society Scandinavia, Ali Zarli, and also his partner, Shushti. They own the company Adapa 360 in Oslo, Norway, and they design 3D 360-degree cameras,
Hmm.
VR cameras, and also do professional videography and photogrammetry, which is
So that's for a lot of people out there. That basically, when you look at your camera and it's got one of those movies where you move your camera around and it moves around the space, that's the kind of thing we're talking about, right?
no, what you're talking about is a panorama.
Okay.
Well, this would be a camera that has a fisheye lens on both sides of it.
Okay.
You turn it on, and you can literally photograph everything around you.
Wow. Okay.
And all 300, like the 360-degree sphere of reality happening around the camera, is filmed simultaneously. So I set up one of these at my talk in Seattle at the Space Entrepreneurs, and I was able to get not only myself and Sean McClinton, our sort of fireside chat, but I had the whole room of everyone's reactions to what we were saying, and was able to when I made the YouTube video, I could splice some of that together into a traditional video on YouTube. But you could also watch one of these with a VR headset on, and literally feel like you're in the room along with everybody.
Are you able to like move around the room and everything with these things?
No, it's wherever the camera is
Okay.
for just one of those 360 videos. But the idea with photogrammetry in VR is that you would basically make a copy of the real life place in VR that you could move around in. And that's what we've done with the Mars Desert Research Station with the Mars VR project, which we hope to release soon, like later this year. It's about 80% done right now.
Mm.
And so I'll talk about that on a future show. But with Ali and Shrishti, they're heading up Adapa 360. They also head up this prestigious Oslo VR Oslo business cluster, which the Mars Society is a member of. And Ali is also a lifetime member of the Mars Society. So he's a great partner for us. And what he did is he sent out a specialized camera rig that was originally going to be part of the crew I was on last year, Crew 197 at the Mars Desert Research Station. Didn't make it to me in time, and so I've trained another person on how to use it, David Murray, who's out at the MDRS right now on Crew 210. So he's
Mm.
out at the MDRS right now as part of Crew 210, and we'll be getting a copy of all the footage he's taking for Mars Society outreach purposes. And
Nice.
so Ali and his team also provided the same type of camera, VR 360 camera capabilities for the NASA Russian project called Sirius 19.
Okay.
And one of the crew members on Sirius 19 that's in sim at this moment is our Russian chapter organizer, Anastasia Stepanova,
Yeah.
which
Yeah.
Jonathan's really familiar with. They were on a crew
Oh,
together.
yes. Wonderful lady.
Yeah, so you guys were on the Mars 160 crew together. And so Ali interviewed Anastasia using a 360 camera, and he put that up on Facebook right before she entered SIM a couple months ago, and we had that featured on the Mars Society Facebook page. And so, really cool stuff. Really happy to be working with Ali and Shrishti, and looking forward to what comes next.
Well, thanks for that, James, on Scandinavia. So, last but not least, we want to also congratulate the Polytechnic of Milan for their project Red Storm, a multiplayer Mars simulation, which won Italian Mars Society's Mars to Earth Award this last week in 2019. So, great job to them. A lot of really cool work there, and we wanted to congratulate them. So one last thing, we're gonna put up this video on the podcast of there's this kid. He's riding on the back of his scooter with his mom, and when you get a long ride, you got to do something. So he decided to just create his own universe, and I thought it was really funny. So
When the scooter ride is too long, you decide to create your own universe. I love it.
exactly. And then because we had Jonathan on the show, we had to make a dig since he's been digging my Texas over here, so we got to make a dig at him. How a boomerang works, and so you get this guy. He throws the boomerang out, and then the dog rings it back. And Jonathan, you had a joke that you told us yesterday. What was the joke?
Oh yes, yeah. In Australia, we say, what do you call the boomerang that doesn't come back?
What's that?
The answer is a stick.
I love it. Okay, so
Very much a dad joke.
oh yeah. Well, you know what? If you don't find it funny, that's okay. I am a dad, and I like it.
Same here.
Oh,
I'm going to tell my son that too because he's got a solid 5 minutes, and he's working on a tight 10. For those that like Mrs. Maisel, you'll know what I'm talking about. Okay. So in closing, we want to thank Jonathan and James. Thank you guys so much for being on the program. Y'all have really made the conversation very interesting, added a lot of value. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this. I know it was a lot of time. We've had some technical issues, but you know what? We're pushing through them.
All right. I can go to bed.
Yeah. Yeah. What time is it there in Australia right now?
Oh, 1:30.
Oh, yeah. Keeping you up late, but we're almost done. Okay, so we also, guys, want to thank you so much for watching our show. We really appreciate it. It's, the main reason we're doing this is to interact with people like you. So if you could do us a favor, this is, just our second episode. We're still starting out. So make sure, if you liked what you heard, hit the like button, subscribe to us so that you can get, watch all of the episodes as they come out. We'll be doing these every 2 weeks. Make sure to comment on YouTube, go to our Discord server, you go on our website, hashtag Mars Talk on Twitter, and, I'm going to make sure that I take a lot of time, and I know other people will as well, to get on there, answer your questions, respond to you. So we want to try and be as interactive as we can with you guys. Make sure also remember, tell us what you think about the space race. Is it even happening here in 2020, or is it something else? What are your thoughts on that? Now, you can visit us at marstalk.org, www.marstalk.org. There you'll find links to YouTube. We're on iTunes now. We have an RSS feed. And all of our social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. You can find us with the tag at Mars Talk Podcast, MarsTalkPodcast. And that'll be across the board there. Also, you can find find me specifically on Twitter at ArchitectNade. That's Architechnid. James, if people wanted to reach out to you, how can they reach you?
Mine's at James Burk. That's James Burk.
All right. Jonathan, do you have a Twitter account, buddy?
No, I don't.
Okay, so if somebody wanted to reach out to you, talk to you about joining Mars Society Australia, or just wanted to talk to you, what's the best way for them to reach you?
My email is best, John, Jon.Clarke, Clarke, at bigpond, bigpond.com.
All right, so you have been listening to Mars Talk, presented by the Mars Society. Producers for this podcast include Lucinda Offer, Nora Hovey, James Burk, and myself. Participants in this episode were Jonathan Clarke, Dr. Jonathan Clarke, thank you so much, James Burk, and of course myself. I am Christopher Tarantola. Thank you so much for listening, guys, and we will see you in 2 weeks.